This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. By the time the first plates touched the white linen at the funeral reading in Edinburgh, I had already heard the old script twice before the soup was served. Be gracious. Keep your voice soft. Do not make a scene. As if my entire life had been a stage built for other people to stand on while I held up the scenery in the dark. The room smelled of polished wood, damp wool coats, and expensive flowers beginning to lose their sweetness under the heat of too many bodies. My aunt had always believed grief should be catered properly, so the private dining room at the George Street Hotel had been arranged with the kind of discretion wealthy families like to mistake for dignity. Silver cutlery, thin candles, black ribbons tied around folded menus nobody would read. On the far wall, old family photographs had been placed on easels beside a framed portrait of my late grandmother, whose expression in oil paint looked less loving than judicial. Even dead, she seemed to be assessing everyone for weaknesses. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, one gloved hand still on the strap of my handbag, letting the room register me before I crossed into it. That had become a habit over the years. Not dramatic, just practical. If I entered too quickly, they could pretend I had drifted in unnoticed, another function of the event. If I paused, they had to acknowledge I had arrived. My mother saw me first. Her face shifted with that practiced efficiency I had known since childhood. A flash of annoyance, a quick public smile, then the softening around the eyes she performed whenever witnesses were present, as if motherhood itself were a burden she carried with uncommon elegance. She rose halfway from her chair, one hand pressed to her chest, the picture of fragile composure in dark navy silk. "Julia, there you are," she said. I did not answer at once. I took in the rest of them instead. My father sat beside her, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, his tie a shade too bright for mourning, but matched, no doubt, to his pocket square with military attention. He had the posture of a man who believed furniture arranged itself around him out of respect. My younger brother, Graham, lounged at the opposite side of the table with the lazy discomfort of someone who had grown used to being defended before he had to speak. His wife, Serena, stared into her water glass with the exhausted expression of a woman who had married into a theater troupe and only just realized the performances were never scheduled, only constant. Around them clustered cousins, in-laws, a former neighbor, one or two distant relations I recognized only by the shape of their noses. Every family event was the same ecosystem, the same currents of pity, judgment, caution, the same hierarchy dressed in seasonal fabric. Then my mother came around the table and kissed the air near my cheek. "We were starting to think work had kept you," she said, loud enough for the nearest cluster to hear. "But I told everyone you always put career first." The line was precise, almost elegant. Not an insult exactly. More a pin slid between the ribs where only I would feel the depth of it. I could practically hear the subtext settling over the room. Poor Julia. So capable. So difficult. Such a shame. I smiled in the way years of hospitality management had taught me, the one that never quite reached the eyes but made people step carefully anyway. Traffic was kind to me for once, I said. I would not have missed this. Another tiny pause. A cousin looked away. Serena looked up. My mother linked her fingers lightly over my forearm and guided me toward the table, steering me to a seat not among the immediate family, but 2 places down, near an arrangement of white lilies and beside my great-aunt Moira, who was nearly 80 and remembered more than people found convenient. I had expected that placement, near enough to be seen, far enough to be excluded from any photograph that might later be posted with some caption about unity, legacy, and the strength of family ties. As I sat, Moira leaned the slightest bit toward me. Her perfume was old-fashioned, powdery, and cool. "You came alone," she murmured. I nodded. "Better," she said, and returned her attention to the folded memorial card as if she had commented on the weather. That was the thing about Aunt Moira. She did not waste language. When I was 12, she had once watched my mother scold me for crying after Graham smashed my school project and then told me in the pantry, in a tone so mild it almost passed for indifference, that some people only felt tall when someone else was made to kneel. I had never forgotten it. Across the room, a waiter began placing bowls of leek and potato soup in front of the guests. My father rose for the opening remarks before anyone had lifted a spoon. Of course he did. Funerals, anniversaries, graduations, Christmas lunches, Sunday roasts if enough people were present. He believed all gatherings improved when filtered through his voice. He began with tribute. He always began with tribute. A few measured lines about my grandmother's discipline, standards, and devotion to family. Then came anecdote. Then sentiment. Then, as reliably as frost in January, narrative correction. The kind that sounds harmless until you notice who it is meant to diminish. He thanked Graham for handling practical arrangements, praised Serena for supporting him through such an emotional week, complimented my cousin Elliot for traveling down from Aberdeen with his children. Then his gaze moved to me, and the room followed. And Julia, of course, has managed to make time between her very demanding commitments. We are grateful when family can still be made a priority. A few polite chuckles, the softest ripple of social approval. It was all so familiar I could have recited the timing. I lowered my spoon and looked at the surface of the soup instead of at him. Years ago, that line would have lit a fuse in me. It would have taken all my strength not to defend myself, explain the rota change, the staffing crisis, the fact that I had left a 12-hour shift early to be here. But explanations were the food this system lived on. The more I offered, the stronger it became. So I simply sat still. Perhaps that unsettled him because my father's gaze lingered an extra beat before moving on. He continued speaking, but I could feel the first misfire of the afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just the faintest sense that his hand had reached for a rail that was no longer there. My mother picked up the thread soon after, circulating sorrow like a hostess refilling glasses. By the second course, she had already repeated 3 separate stories about how difficult the last year had been for the family. Not for herself. For the family. The phrase did heavy lifting in our house. It usually meant everyone except the person currently being sacrificed to preserve appearances. At one point, she touched my wrist and told the woman beside her that I had always been sensitive, as though this were a charming childhood trait and not a lifelong accusation. Later, when dessert menus appeared and nobody wanted them, she mentioned the burden parents carry when one child insists on making distance feel like punishment. That earned a hush, then sympathetic nods from people who had not seen my mother hang up on me 3 times in 1 week the year the bank first called. I kept my breathing level, because the truth was, I had not come here hoping anyone would suddenly understand me. Hope had cost too much already. I had come because the timing was too exact to ignore. The funeral reading had been planned for months. The reunion afterward had been my mother's idea. Everyone in one room. Everyone softened by grief. Everyone eager to mistake reconciliation for decency. And then, 3 days earlier, a fraud investigator had walked into my office just after 11 in the morning and asked if we could speak somewhere private. I had known before she showed me the file. Even now, seated beneath the chandeliers while my father lifted his glass for another tribute to family resilience, I could feel the weight of the object in my handbag. Not large, not ornate, something sentimental at first glance, almost old-fashioned. The kind of thing no one would notice until I placed it on the table and opened it in front of them. Across from me, Serena met my eyes for half a second, then glanced down toward my bag. She knew I had brought something. What she did not know yet was that by the time coffee arrived, the room would stop belonging to my parents, and the first crack in their story was already beginning to show. Part 2. I had learned something important working in hotels for nearly 15 years. Rooms remember tension before people admit it exists. You could feel it in the air, the same way you sensed a storm before the rain actually began. The shift was subtle. Conversations grew slightly louder to cover unease. Chairs scraped more often. Someone laughed a little too long at something that was not quite funny. It was a choreography of denial. And I had spent half my career watching it unfold at wedding rehearsals, corporate dinners, and family gatherings where inheritance and resentment shared the same tablecloth. This room was no different. The funeral reading had started with quiet solemnity, but now the second course had been cleared and the wine had begun loosening tongues. My father stood near the head of the table, leaning one hand against the back of his chair as though the entire gathering had assembled specifically to witness his authority. He had always liked that posture. It made him look like a man who owned decisions. My mother sat beside him, smiling softly at every sympathetic glance directed her way. And me? I remained exactly where she had placed me, 2 seats removed from the center, near the lilies, beside Aunt Moira, who was currently folding her napkin into neat squares as if precision could substitute for commentary. She had not spoken again since greeting me, but twice now I had noticed her looking toward my handbag with the faintest narrowing of her eyes. Moira saw patterns the rest of the family preferred to ignore. Across the table, Graham had begun explaining something about his new investment project to a cousin who clearly did not understand a word of it but nodded enthusiastically anyway. That had always been Graham's particular talent. Confidence as camouflage. If you sounded certain enough, people rarely checked the details. Serena, however, was not watching her husband. She was watching me. Not openly. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Just small glances that came and went like reflections on glass. I could almost hear the question forming in her mind. Why had I come today when I had avoided family events for nearly a year? Why did I look so calm when the usual tension was clearly being prepared for me? Because Serena had been present once before. She had not seen everything, but she had heard enough. That had been 2 years ago at Christmas, the year my father had tried to turn the dinner table into a tribunal about gratitude. I remembered Serena sitting at the far end of the table then, very still, her fork resting on the edge of her plate, as my mother described the sacrifices parents make for unappreciative children. It had been the first time someone outside the immediate family looked genuinely uncomfortable. People who grew up inside a system often cannot see its shape. Outsiders notice immediately. Now she lifted her glass and took a slow sip of water, eyes briefly lowering again to my bag. I did not move. Instead, I let my attention drift toward the far end of the room, where 2 men in dark suits stood speaking quietly near the doorway. They had arrived halfway through the meal. One was clearly hotel staff, judging by the subtle pin on his lapel. The other I did not recognize, but recognition was not necessary. The fraud investigator had warned me there might be observers. Nothing official, she had said carefully when we sat in my office earlier that week. Just professionals who prefer to understand family dynamics before documents appear in court. At the time, I had asked only one question. Would they attend the gathering? Her answer had been measured. If the opportunity presents itself. Apparently, it had. I shifted slightly in my chair and let my gaze return to the table just as my father cleared his throat again. He had finished his tribute to my grandmother and was now moving into the familiar territory of legacy. My grandmother had believed strongly in responsibility, he explained, and in maintaining family integrity. Those values, he said, were increasingly rare these days. Several people nodded. I almost smiled. Integrity had always been one of my father's favorite words. He used it frequently, especially when reminding people how much he had done for them. And he had done many things, just not the ones he claimed. My mother reached for her glass and added gently that parenting was never easy when children had strong personalities. The remark floated across the table like perfume, light, harmless, faintly sympathetic, but every head turned toward me anyway. Of course they did. There is a role assigned in families like mine. Someone must carry the narrative weight of disappointment. Someone must be the example whispered about after dessert. For years, that had been me. The difficult daughter, the ungrateful one, the girl who left home too early and never properly appreciated how much had been done for her education. Education. Even now, the word felt like a pebble under my tongue, because that was the beginning of everything. Not the arguments. Not the distance. Not even the phone calls from the bank that had first appeared 6 years ago like small, polite ghosts. The beginning had been paperwork. Invisible paperwork. Documents I had never signed but somehow carried my name with such convincing authority that an entire financial system believed them. I remembered the first time the bank called. I had been working as an assistant manager at a smaller hotel then, just outside Glasgow. It was a Sunday afternoon, the quiet hour between checkout chaos and evening arrivals. My phone buzzed while I was checking housekeeping reports. The voice on the other end had been courteous, even friendly. They wanted to discuss the repayment schedule for my student loan consolidation. I had told them there must be a mistake. I had never taken out a student loan consolidation. The woman on the phone had paused. Then she had read out the amount. Even now, sitting here years later with candles flickering against the polished walls of the dining room, I could still feel the cold that had moved through my chest when I heard the number. It was large enough to ruin a young career before it began. Large enough to trap someone for decades. Large enough that the bank had no reason to doubt its legitimacy. At the time, I had laughed nervously and told them they must have confused me with someone else. But the woman on the phone had been patient. She had verified my name, my date of birth, my previous address. Every detail matched, except the signature. That had been mine too. Or at least, it looked exactly like mine. For a long time afterward, I convinced myself there had been some kind of administrative error. Maybe the university had misplaced forms. Maybe someone had entered the wrong identification number. I spent months gathering documents, writing emails, calling departments that transferred me to other departments until entire afternoons disappeared into hold music. Every conversation ended the same way. The paperwork was correct. The signature was valid. The loans were legally mine. When I finally brought the letters home to my parents' house for advice, I had expected confusion, maybe concern, possibly even anger on my behalf. Instead, my father had read them very carefully. Then he had sighed. He said something about financial realities, about opportunities I would not have had without certain decisions, about how young people rarely understood the complexity of these matters. My mother had put a hand on my shoulder and told me not to make trouble over things that had already been arranged for my benefit. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, just enough. Because deep down, even then, I understood what they were really saying. The loans had been taken in my name, but not by me, and they expected me to carry them anyway. Across the table now, Graham laughed at something my father said and lifted his glass. My mother smiled warmly at the guests around her, her posture perfect, her voice gentle. To anyone watching from the outside, we looked like a successful family honoring its past. But the truth was sitting quietly beside my chair, inside my handbag. And somewhere near the doorway, the men in dark suits were still watching. I let my fingers rest lightly on the clasp of the bag, not opening it. Not yet, because the real shift in the room had not happened. But I could feel it coming. And when it did, the story my parents had been telling for years would begin to unravel in front of everyone. Part 3. By the time the main course arrived, the room had warmed to that strange, artificial comfort that follows prolonged politeness. Candles burned lower. Jackets had been loosened. Conversations moved in gentle loops around safe topics like travel, property prices, and how quickly the city had changed in the past decade. To anyone entering the room at that moment, it might have looked like a perfectly normal family gathering. but tension rarely disappears. It simply learns to sit quietly until someone gives it a reason to move again. I watched the waiters place the plates with practiced precision. Roast lamb, potatoes glazed with butter, a small arrangement of carrots that looked almost architectural in their neatness. The kind of meal designed to encourage gratitude and silence. My father approved of meals like this. Food had always been one of his favorite tools for controlling the mood of a room. When people ate well, they felt obligated to behave well. That was his philosophy. And today, he was determined to keep the atmosphere exactly where he wanted it. I saw it in the way he kept conversation flowing, always directing attention away from anything that might become too personal or unpredictable. He asked cousins about their children, commented on the renovation of a nearby building, praised the staff for the service. Every gesture carried the quiet authority of someone who believed he understood how gatherings worked. What he did not realize was that the structure he relied on had already begun to weaken, because stories require agreement to survive. And tonight, agreement was beginning to fracture. It started with something small, Serena. She had barely spoken since the meal began. Normally, my sister-in-law compensated for Graham's casual arrogance by smoothing conversations around him. She had the careful diplomacy of someone raised in a different kind of household, one where people actually finished sentences before someone else corrected them. But tonight, she remained quiet. At first, I assumed she was simply tired. The past week had been exhausting for everyone. My grandmother's passing had pulled relatives from across Scotland, and the emotional theater surrounding it had required energy that Serena rarely enjoyed spending. But after the second glass of wine was poured, I noticed something else. She kept watching the doorway. Not openly, just quick glances as if expecting someone else to arrive. I followed her gaze once and saw the same two men still standing near the far wall. They were no longer speaking, they were observing. The man with the hotel pin had stepped slightly aside now, allowing the other to remain positioned where the entire room could be seen clearly. He had the posture of someone accustomed to waiting. It was a professional patience. I wondered briefly what my parents would think if they knew. Probably nothing. People who live comfortably inside their own version of events rarely imagine anyone else is documenting the details. Across the table, Graham leaned back in his chair and began describing a property development opportunity near Leith. Something about investors, something about expansion. His voice carried the relaxed enthusiasm of someone accustomed to admiration. Our cousin Elliot listened with exaggerated interest, nodding at strategic moments. My father seemed pleased. Graham had always been his favorite audience. It was a dynamic established so early in our childhood that by the time I was old enough to question it, the pattern had already become invisible to everyone except me. Graham made plans. I made explanations. That had been the arrangement. Until I stopped explaining. A waiter passed behind me and refilled my water glass. I thanked him quietly. The rhythm of the room continued uninterrupted. Then my mother placed her napkin gently on the table and turned slightly toward the guests seated along the opposite side. "You know," she said softly, "this week has made me think so much about the sacrifices families make for their children." The room shifted immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Conversations slowed, someone lowered their fork. Even Graham paused mid-sentence. My mother had a remarkable ability to guide attention without appearing to request it. She never raised her voice. She simply adjusted the emotional temperature until people leaned toward her naturally. "Raising children is never simple," she continued. "You want to give them opportunities, education, stability. Sometimes that means making decisions they may not understand when they are young." A few sympathetic murmurs. I kept my eyes on my plate. Here it was, the familiar path. My father folded his hands together thoughtfully, the way he did when preparing to appear reasonable. Graham shifted in his chair but said nothing. My mother sighed gently. Of course, sometimes those sacrifices are misunderstood later. Some children grow up believing everything was easy for them, that their parents simply stood aside and watched them succeed. Another pause. Several heads turned toward me. The choreography was perfect. I almost admired it. For years, this moment had been the center of every family gathering. The careful introduction of disappointment, followed by the implication that my independence had been built on invisible parental generosity. No one ever asked for specifics. No one ever questioned what those sacrifices actually were. Until recently, I had never had the documentation to answer them properly. Now I did. But I did not move. Not yet. Because the power of their story depended on something simple. My reaction. If I argued, they won. If I defended myself, they won. If I looked angry, emotional, wounded, they won. The only move they had never prepared for was silence. So I simply lifted my glass and took a sip of water. My mother's eyes flickered. Just for a second. She had expected a response by now. A denial, perhaps, a polite correction, something that allowed her to continue shaping the narrative. Instead, she found herself speaking into stillness. Families are complicated, she continued after a moment. But at the end of the day, we try to do what is best for our children, even when they do not appreciate it. A cousin nodded sympathetically. Someone murmured agreement. Across the table, Serena looked directly at me now, not with pity, with something closer to curiosity, because the tension in the room had changed again. My father sensed it too. I could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw. The performance was drifting off script, and he did not yet understand why. He cleared his throat. Your mother only means that we did everything possible to support our children's futures, he said calmly. Education especially required considerable commitment. There it was, the word again. Education. He spoke it casually, almost lazily, as if it were a simple detail of parenting. But I noticed something interesting then. At the far end of the room, the man in the dark suit had shifted position slightly. He was closer now. Not enough to interrupt the gathering, just close enough to hear clearly. I wondered if my parents noticed. Probably not. People accustomed to control rarely monitor the edges of their own stage. My father continued speaking, explaining how families sometimes had to make difficult financial decisions to ensure opportunities were available. His voice was calm, authoritative, completely confident, and completely unaware that the person who had first questioned those financial decisions was now sitting quietly in the same room. The fraud investigator had been very precise during our meeting earlier that week. The case had been dormant for years, she explained. The bank originally assumed the loans were legitimate because all documentation appeared consistent. But certain discrepancies had surfaced during a broader audit. Small ones. The kind that did not matter individually, until someone looked closer. Now the file was open again, and suddenly the signatures looked less convincing. Across the table, my father raised his glass. To family, he said warmly. Even when we misunderstand one another, we remain connected by responsibility. Several people echoed the toast, glasses lifted. Wine caught the candlelight. I raised my own glass slowly, and as I did, I noticed Aunt Moira watching my handbag again. Not suspicious, almost approving. Because unlike the others, she seemed to understand something important. Tonight was not about emotion, it was about records. And somewhere inside that bag, the past my parents had carefully rewritten was waiting to be opened. The only question left was when? Part 4. The strange thing about long-term tension is that people inside it stop noticing how much energy it takes to maintain. For years, every family gathering had required the same careful choreography. My parents would present the version of events they preferred. I would either defend myself, which made me look ungrateful, or stay quiet, which allowed their story to settle over the room like dust. Either way, the result was the same. The family left believing the structure was intact. Tonight felt different, not because anyone had said something dramatic, because I had stopped participating in the pattern. It took the room a while to understand that. The plates were cleared, dessert menus appeared, but remained mostly ignored. Coffee was poured in small porcelain cups that clicked softly against saucers as waiters moved between chairs. The rhythm of polite conversation resumed, but something beneath it had shifted. I could feel it in the occasional glance directed toward me, in the way my father's voice carried a touch more effort now when he guided topics away from uncomfortable territory. People sense imbalance before they can explain it. Across from me, Serena finally spoke. She did it carefully, the way someone tests the depth of water before stepping forward. "So, Julia," she said lightly, "you're still managing the hotel near Princes Street, aren't you?" The question seemed harmless enough, but it broke the pattern, because normally the conversation about my life came through my parents. They summarized my career the same way they summarized everything else I did, with faint disappointment disguised as pride. Julia is very career-focused. Julia always preferred independence. Julia never had much patience for guidance. Serena had asked me directly. I looked up and met her eyes. "Yes," I said. "Still there." My cousin Elliot leaned forward immediately. "That's the Regency Grand, right?" he asked. "I think I attended a conference there last autumn." I nodded. His expression brightened. "Excellent place. The staff were remarkably organized. Whoever runs operations there knows what they're doing." I thanked him quietly. Across the table, my father's smile remained in place, but it had tightened slightly. Professional recognition had always complicated his version of the hierarchy. In his narrative, Graham represented success. Graham invested, expanded, built things. Graham moved through life with the easy confidence of someone expected to win. My achievements had always required reinterpretation, hard work instead of talent, ambition instead of competence, convenient explanations, but public compliments disrupted that balance. My mother stepped in quickly. "Julia has always been very determined," she said. Even as a child, she preferred to do things her own way. The line landed softly but firmly, guiding the conversation back toward familiar territory. Independent, difficult, gratefulness optional. Serena did not react immediately. She stirred her coffee slowly, watching the swirl of cream disappear. Then she said something unexpected. "It must take quite a lot of responsibility to manage a place like that." The comment hung in the air. Not confrontational, but not dismissive either. I noticed several people glance at my father. Responsibility was a word he liked to claim. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether Serena's remark was praise or provocation. He decided to treat it as neutral. "Julia always had strong organizational instincts," he said. "Even when she was young, that much was true." But the tone carried the faint implication that those instincts had often been inconvenient. The room relaxed again slightly. Conversation drifted toward travel stories, recent renovations in the city, the rising cost of property, safe ground. Yet beneath it all, the tension remained. Because the earlier remarks about sacrifice had not disappeared, they were simply waiting for their next opening. I saw it in my mother's posture. She had not abandoned the narrative she began earlier. She was merely adjusting her timing. That was one of her most effective strategies. Patience. If the room did not respond immediately, she simply waited for the next moment when attention shifted naturally toward family history. And family history always arrived eventually at gatherings like this. It happened about 10 minutes later. My cousin Margaret began describing how expensive university had become for her son. Tuition fees, accommodation, textbooks. The list of costs grew longer with every sentence. Several people sighed sympathetically. My mother listened with attentive concern, nodding gently. "Yes, education can be a tremendous financial strain," she said after Margaret finished. "Parents sometimes make extraordinary sacrifices just to give their children the opportunities they deserve." There it was again. Education. This time the word landed heavier, because now the context was clearer. The implication did not even require my name. My father leaned back slightly, folding his hands with quiet satisfaction. The narrative had returned to familiar territory. He glanced toward me briefly. Not openly challenging, just waiting. Waiting for me to acknowledge the generosity that had supposedly shaped my life. Waiting for the usual defensive reaction. I felt Aunt Moira shift beside me. Her chair creaked softly. Then she said something so mild it almost sounded like a casual observation. "Education is expensive indeed," she murmured. Several heads turned toward her. Moira rarely joined family discussions unless she had something specific in mind. My mother smiled politely. "Yes, it certainly is." Moira studied her coffee cup thoughtfully. "But paperwork for such matters must be very precise," she added. The room grew still, not silent, but attentive. My father's expression did not change, yet I noticed the small tightening at the corner of his mouth. Moira continued calmly. "Loans, contracts, signatures, all those details must be quite important for banks." The word signatures moved through the air like a quiet ripple. Serena looked at me again. Elliot blinked in mild confusion. My mother laughed softly. "Oh, Moira," she said, "surely no one wants to discuss financial paperwork at a memorial gathering." Moira lifted one thin eyebrow. "No," she said gently. "Perhaps not." She did not look at me again, but the message had been delivered. Across the room, the man in the dark suit had stepped closer still. Not enough to interrupt, just enough to hear everything. My father straightened slightly in his chair. "Let's not turn a family remembrance into a discussion of bureaucracy," he said smoothly. "We all know that supporting children through university can require complicated arrangements." Complicated arrangements. The phrase hung there. I felt my fingers brush the edge of my handbag again. Inside it, the small object remained exactly where I had placed it before leaving my flat earlier that afternoon. The investigator had been very clear. Timing mattered. Documentation mattered even more. But public narratives collapse best when they contradict themselves first. Right now, my parents were still building theirs, and every word they spoke made the eventual correction more precise. Across the table, Serena set her spoon down carefully. She glanced once toward the doorway where the two men stood watching. Then she looked back at me. Something had changed in her expression, not curiosity anymore. Recognition. Because she understood what Moira's comment about signatures actually meant. The room had not exploded. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a quiet, deliberate shift in direction. And for the first time that evening, I noticed my father studying my handbag. He was not suspicious yet, but he had begun to sense that something in the room was no longer under his control. He simply did not know what. Not yet. And that uncertainty was about to become the most dangerous thing in the room. Part 5. The first real fracture did not come with shouting. It came with curiosity. People imagine family confrontations as loud, explosive affairs, raised voices, accusations thrown like glass across the table. But the truth is far quieter. Real collapses begin when the story everyone has agreed to repeat suddenly develops a detail that does not quite fit. And once that happens, people start asking questions. Not big questions, small ones. Across the table, my cousin Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Signatures?" she said, looking toward Aunt Moira with mild confusion. "Why signatures?" Moira lifted her coffee cup and took a slow sip before answering. "Banks tend to care about such things," she said calmly. That was all. But it was enough, because now the word existed in the room. Signatures. My father laughed lightly. "Well, I suppose they do," he said, "but surely we're not about to conduct an audit during a family meal." A few polite chuckles followed. The performance was still functioning, barely. My mother smiled at Moira with the soft patience she used for relatives she considered eccentric. "Moira always did have a practical mind," she said gently. Moira did not respond. Instead, she looked at me. Not in a demanding way, more like someone waiting for a clock to strike the correct hour. Across the table, Serena's fingers had gone still around her coffee cup. Graham shifted in his chair. He did not yet understand what was happening, but instinct told him something uncomfortable was approaching. He glanced at me, then quickly away. I could almost hear his internal calculation. If this becomes unpleasant, distance yourself. That had always been his strategy. My father, meanwhile, was still trying to guide the conversation back towards safe ground. Education is simply one of those things families invest in, he continued smoothly. Every parent hopes their children will appreciate the opportunities given to them. Opportunity, sacrifice, responsibility. He had assembled the usual vocabulary again. Normally, this was the moment when I would respond, when I would either defend myself or sit quietly while the implications settled over the room. But tonight I did something different. I reached for my handbag. The movement was small, almost casual, but several people noticed immediately. My father's eyes flickered toward it. Serena leaned forward slightly. Moira did not move at all. I opened the bag slowly. Inside were several ordinary items: my phone, a small notebook, a lipstick, a pair of reading glasses, and beneath them the object I had brought. I lifted it out carefully. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A small leather folder, dark brown, worn slightly at the edges. The kind of thing people often use to carry old letters or sentimental keepsakes. Nothing threatening, nothing dramatic. Just a personal item brought to a family gathering. I placed it gently on the table beside my coffee cup. No one spoke. My father watched the folder with the expression of a man trying to decide whether something harmless might suddenly become inconvenient. My mother smiled again. "Julia, dear," she said lightly, "surely this isn't the moment for paperwork." I met her eyes calmly. "It isn't paperwork," I said. Technically, that was true. The folder itself contained several things. Some of them were documents, but that was not what made the room dangerous. What made it dangerous was the existence of evidence. And evidence does not care about tone. My father leaned back slightly in his chair. "Julia," he said, his voice still patient, "if you have something you wish to discuss, perhaps another time would be more appropriate." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The old script was trying to assert itself again. Family matters should remain private. Disagreements should be handled quietly. Do not embarrass the family. But that script required my cooperation, and I had already stopped participating. Across the room, the man in the dark suit had moved even closer now. Still unobtrusive, still silent, but close enough that the entire table could see him if they turned. Serena noticed first. Her gaze flicked toward him, then back to the folder. Something in her posture changed. The room had become sharper somehow, more attentive. I rested my hand lightly on the leather cover. "Do you remember," I said calmly, "the year I moved to Glasgow for my first hotel job?" My father frowned slightly. "Of course," he said. "You were determined to prove you could manage entirely on your own." That was his version. I nodded. "Yes, that was the year the bank first called me." Several people looked up. The sentence had landed too precisely to ignore. My mother laughed softly. "Oh, Julia," she said, "surely you're not still thinking about that misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. A beautiful word. Flexible, harmless, completely disconnected from legal definitions. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder. Inside were several items, letters, copies of bank statements, a printed timeline, and one small plastic sleeve containing photocopies of 2 signatures. I did not take them out yet. I simply let the contents remain visible. Across the table, Elliot leaned forward instinctively. Graham's face had gone pale. My father's expression hardened slightly. "Julia," he said quietly, "this is neither the time nor the place." I looked at him. "Actually," I said, "this is exactly the time. Because 3 days ago, a fraud investigator visited my office." The room froze. Not dramatically, just completely. Even the waiters stopped moving for a moment. My mother blinked. "Fraud investigator?" she repeated lightly, as if the phrase were merely unusual, as if it carried no particular significance. But her fingers tightened around her napkin. I nodded. Yes. Silence settled over the table. Across the room, the man in the dark suit did not move. My father spoke carefully now. "And what does that have to do with us?" There it was, the first defensive line. Distance. Denial. The assumption that authority alone could make the situation disappear. I reached into the folder and lifted one sheet of paper. Just one. It contained 2 signatures printed side by side, one labeled with my name, the other taken from a document I had personally signed at the hotel only 6 months earlier. They were identical, almost perfectly, except for one detail. A small hesitation in the curve of the final letter, something a forensic examiner had circled in red. I placed the page on the table between us. The investigator explained something very interesting to me, I said calmly. No one spoke. My father stared at the paper. My mother's smile had vanished completely now. Across the table, Serena's breathing had slowed, as if she were listening very carefully. I folded my hands beside the folder. Apparently, I continued, signatures that look convincing at first glance can still reveal who actually wrote them. And somewhere behind us, near the doorway, the man in the dark suit took another quiet step forward, because the conversation was no longer theoretical, and the story my parents had told for years had just encountered its first piece of proof. Part 6. For a moment, no one at the table moved, not even the waiters. The sheet of paper lay between my father and me like a quiet accusation, the 2 signatures staring up at the ceiling lights. One was taken from the student loan documents that had followed me for years like a shadow I could never outrun. The other came from a hotel licensing form I had signed myself not long ago. They looked almost identical, almost, but the investigator had shown me the details. The microscopic hesitation in the final stroke, the difference in pressure along the curve of the second letter, tiny things the human eye ignored unless someone trained it to look closely. Now the red circles around those differences glowed faintly under the dining room lights. My father did not touch the paper. He stared at it as if staring long enough might cause the ink to rearrange itself. My mother spoke first. "Julia," she said gently, "you're upsetting people." Her voice was soft again, the same tone she used whenever she wanted to transform conflict into embarrassment. The trick was simple. If the person raising a problem could be made to look emotional or dramatic, the problem itself lost credibility. It had worked for years. But tonight, the room was different because no one at the table was looking at me. They were looking at the paper. Elliot leaned forward slightly. "Is that a loan document?" he asked cautiously. Before I could answer, my father pushed back his chair. The sound of wood scraping against the floor echoed louder than it should have. "Julia," he said sharply, "enough." There it was, the first crack in his composure, not shouting, not yet. But the authority in his voice had hardened. "This is not appropriate conversation for a memorial gathering," he continued. "If you have concerns about financial paperwork, we can discuss them privately." Privately. The word drifted across the table. For years, privacy had been the shield that protected my parents' version of events. Anything uncomfortable could be dismissed with that single instruction. Family matters stayed within the family. But this was no longer just family. Across the room, the man in the dark suit had stepped close enough now that several guests had turned to notice him. He stood quietly near the wall, hands folded loosely, observing the table with professional patience. My father saw him. I watched the exact moment recognition did not arrive, because my father assumed anyone observing the room must be hotel staff. That assumption would soon become very expensive. My mother leaned toward me again. "Julia, dear," she murmured, "you're making people uncomfortable." I met her gaze calmly. "The bank was uncomfortable too," I said. A faint murmur rippled along the table. Graham finally spoke. "Julia, come on," he muttered. "This is ridiculous." He had always preferred problems that could be dismissed quickly. Ridiculous, dramatic, overreaction. Those were the words he used whenever something threatened the comfortable structure of his life. I turned slightly toward him. "Do you remember the year I kept receiving letters from the bank?" I asked. Graham's jaw tightened. "That was ages ago," he said. "Yes," I replied. 6 years. Silence again. Moira watched the entire exchange with the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. Serena had not looked away from the paper since I placed it on the table. Finally, she spoke quietly. What exactly did the investigator say? The question landed with surgical precision, because it was not defensive, it was curious, and curiosity breaks narratives faster than anger ever could. I turned the page slightly so the signatures faced the rest of the table. She said something very interesting about handwriting analysis, I explained. My father's voice cut through the room. That is enough. He was no longer smiling. His hands rested flat on the table now, fingers spread slightly as if holding the surface steady. You are misunderstanding a complicated financial arrangement that was made years ago for your benefit, he said. Benefit. Another familiar word. Across the table, Elliot looked from my father to the document again. What kind of arrangement requires someone else's signature, he asked. My mother inhaled sharply. Now the room had truly shifted, because Elliot had not grown up inside the system. He was simply following logic. My father opened his mouth to respond, but someone else spoke first. From the doorway. Actually, a voice said calmly, "That's exactly the question we've been reviewing." Every head in the room turned. The man in the dark suit stepped forward. He moved slowly, politely, the way professionals do when entering a room where emotions are already fragile. The hotel manager beside him looked deeply uncomfortable. The man stopped near the end of the table and nodded courteously. "Good evening," he said. "I apologize for interrupting what is clearly a private gathering." My father's expression darkened immediately. "This is a private event," he said coldly. "Yes," the man replied. "But since certain documents have just been introduced publicly, I believe clarification may actually help everyone here understand the situation more accurately." A faint ripple of unease moved through the guests. My mother's voice was tight now. "And who exactly are you?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small identification card. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the information as if it were the most ordinary detail in the world. "My name is David Hargreaves. I work with the Financial Compliance Division reviewing irregularities in several historical student loan accounts." The word irregularities landed heavier than fraud would have, because it sounded official, technical, real. My father stood up completely now. "This is absurd," he said. Mr. Hargreaves remained calm. "Perhaps," he replied. "But when a signature appears on loan documents that may not have been written by the person legally responsible for the debt, it becomes a matter that banks, and occasionally courts, take very seriously." Several people at the table stared at my father. Others looked at the paper again. Serena whispered something under her breath that sounded very much like, "Oh my God." My mother's face had gone pale. "Julia," she said sharply, "what have you done?" The question almost made me laugh. For years, I had carried the weight of a debt that was never mine. For years, I had listened while they described it as an opportunity they had created for me. Now the evidence sat in the center of the table, and suddenly they wanted to know what I had done. I folded my hands calmly beside the leather folder. "All I did," I said quietly, "was bring the same documents the bank has been reviewing." Mr. Hargreaves nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "The same documents that show the loans were approved using a signature matching Miss Parker's name." My father's voice rose, because they were her loans. Mr. Hargreaves tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps." Then he looked down at the sheet of paper with the red circles. However, he continued, "Handwriting analysis suggests something rather different." The room felt suddenly smaller. People shifted in their chairs. My mother looked at my father with growing alarm. And for the first time since I placed the folder on the table, my father realized the conversation was no longer under his control. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again, and the most interesting detail, he said, is that the signature used on the loan agreement appears to match handwriting samples from another document signed several years earlier. He paused. Then he looked directly at my father. A document authorizing parental access to a university financial account. The silence that followed was complete. Because now the story was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about authorship. And somewhere inside my father's expression, the certainty that had carried him through every family gathering for decades finally began to crack. Part 7. The silence after Mr. Hargreaves finished speaking was not the ordinary quiet of a room waiting for someone to respond. It was the kind of silence that spreads when people suddenly realize they may have been listening to the wrong story for years. No one reached for their coffee. No one lifted a fork. Even the soft clink of glasses from the bar outside the dining room seemed distant now, as though the world beyond this table had moved slightly out of focus. My father remained standing. For a moment, he looked less like the confident patriarch who had directed family gatherings for decades, and more like a man calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Then his voice returned. Sharp. Controlled. "This is outrageous," he said. "A stranger walks into a private memorial and begins making accusations based on speculation." Mr. Hargreaves did not appear offended. He folded his hands lightly in front of him. "Actually," he said, "nothing I've mentioned tonight is speculation. It's part of an ongoing review." The word review sounded deceptively harmless, but anyone who had ever dealt with financial institutions knew exactly what it meant. Files had been opened, documents had been examined, people had started asking questions. Across the table, my mother's breathing had grown noticeably shallow. "Julia," she said again, her voice tight, "what exactly did you tell these people?" I looked at her calmly. The truth. The phrase landed harder than any accusation, because truth has a way of stripping away the decorations people place around their behavior. Graham leaned forward suddenly. "Hold on," he said. "Are we seriously pretending Julia didn't know about those loans?" His voice carried a desperate edge now, as if confidence alone might restore the balance of the room. "You went to university," he continued, looking directly at me. "You signed forms like everyone else." A few relatives nodded uncertainly. The argument sounded reasonable, until Mr. Hargreaves spoke again. "Actually, Miss Parker's university records show she declined the optional consolidation program during her final year," he said. Graham blinked. "What?" The investigator's tone remained calm. "The loan documents in question were submitted nearly 8 months later." 8 months. The number hung in the air. My cousin Elliot frowned, but if she didn't apply, he began. Mr. Fier Hargreaves finished the thought for him. Then someone else did. Across the table, Serena slowly set her coffee cup down. She had not taken her eyes off the document since it appeared, and now something in her expression had shifted from confusion to understanding. 8 months later, she repeated quietly. She looked at my father. "That would have been around the time Julia was already working in Glasgow, wouldn't it?" My father said nothing. The question did not require an answer. Several people at the table were already doing the math. Moira spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Julia moved out that spring," she said mildly. "I remember because the lilacs were blooming." No one corrected her. My mother's composure was beginning to fracture. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "We helped our daughter with her education, that is all." Helped. The word sounded painfully small now. Mr. Hargreaves nodded politely. "Yes," he said. "That's certainly one interpretation." He stepped slightly closer to the table. "However, the bank's concern is that the application includes a signature that appears to have been written by someone with access to Miss Parker's personal information and previous documents containing her handwriting." He paused. Then he added gently, "Someone within the family." The room exhaled collectively. No one spoke. But the shift was unmistakable. For years, my parents had controlled the narrative by making everything sound complicated, emotional, or ungrateful. But documents were simpler than stories. They did not care about feelings. They only cared about sequence, dates, signatures, and access. My father's eyes moved slowly from Mr. Hargreaves to the paper on the table, then to me. The anger in his expression had deepened into something darker. You brought this here deliberately, he said. I did not deny it. Yes. A faint gasp came from somewhere near the far end of the table. My mother stood up suddenly. This is a family matter, she said, her voice trembling now. It should never have been discussed in front of strangers. Moira raised one thin eyebrow. You were quite comfortable discussing Julia's gratitude earlier, she observed. The remark landed with perfect precision. My mother looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time that evening. Serena leaned forward again. Wait, she said slowly. Her eyes moved between the document and my father. If the signature wasn't Julia's, then whose was it? The question felt like a stone dropped into deep water. Everyone turned toward my father. For years, he had filled every silence with explanation, but now explanation required something he no longer had: evidence. Mr. Hargreaves did not speak again. He simply waited. That was the investigator's skill: patience. When facts are strong enough, people eventually expose themselves trying to escape them. My father's jaw tightened. You're all jumping to conclusions, he said, but the authority in his voice had thinned. Elliot looked at the paper again. Those signatures are nearly identical, he said. Yes, I replied. Nearly. I slid another page from the folder. This one contained enlarged handwriting samples from several documents, one from my employment file, one from the student loan agreement, and one from a university authorization form signed years earlier. 3 signatures, side by side, circled in red ink. Across the table, Serena inhaled sharply, because the third signature did not belong to me. It belonged to my father. The room did not erupt. There was no shouting, just the slow, devastating realization moving from one face to another. Moira studied the page for several seconds. Then she looked at my father. Well, she said calmly, that does look rather familiar, Fries. My mother grabbed the back of her chair. This is nonsense, she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. Because everyone at the table could see the shapes, the loops, the pressure marks. My father's handwriting had always been distinctive. Even Graham could not ignore it. He stared at the page as if hoping his eyes would correct themselves. Dad, he said quietly. But my father did not answer him. Instead, he looked at me. And for the first time that evening, there was no performance left in his expression. Only calculation. Because the story he had relied on for years had just encountered something he could not control. Proof. And dessert had not even been served yet. Part 8. The room did not explode the way people expect when a truth finally appears. There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations thrown across the table like broken glass. Instead, the air thickened with a kind of stunned stillness that made every small movement suddenly loud. Someone set down a fork. A chair creaked. A candle flickered as if even the flame had become uncertain about its place in the room. On the table between us, the page with the 3 signatures remained perfectly still. Mine, the forged loan signature, and my father's handwriting sample from the university authorization form. 3 shapes of ink, 3 quiet witnesses. Across the table, Graham was staring at the paper with the expression of someone trying to force his brain to reject what his eyes were clearly seeing. Dad, he said again. My father did not answer him. Instead, he turned slowly toward Mr. Hargreaves. You are making a serious allegation, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The investigator nodded politely. No allegation has been made here, Mr. Parker, only observations based on documented evidence. His tone remained neutral, almost gentle. But neutrality can feel cruel when someone is desperate for the conversation to become emotional instead. Emotion is easier to dismiss. Evidence is not. My mother spoke next, her voice trembling with a fragile sort of outrage. This is unbelievable, she said. We supported Julia for years. We paid her tuition when scholarships fell through. We made sacrifices for her education. The familiar words returned. Sacrifice, support, opportunity. But now they sounded different, because the room had begun to notice the gap between language and documentation. Serena leaned slightly forward. Her voice was quiet. No one asked whether you helped her, she said. Everyone turned toward her. The question was, whether you signed her name. The simplicity of the sentence made the room feel even smaller. My father's gaze moved back to the page, then to me, and for a moment I saw something new in his expression. Not anger, not even denial, recognition. He understood the structure of the trap now, not because I had raised my voice, but because the room had witnesses, relatives, a bank investigator, hotel staff, people who had no emotional investment in protecting his version of the past. My father inhaled slowly. "You're misunderstanding a financial arrangement that was made with the best intentions," he said. Mr. Hargreaves tilted his head slightly. Best intentions are rarely the issue in cases like this. Across the table, Elliot spoke carefully. "What kind of arrangement requires someone else's signature on a loan?" No one answered immediately. My mother looked at my father again. "Say something." Her eyes seemed to plead. But explanations require details, and details had never been part of their story, because details leave traces. Moira lifted the page and studied it more closely. She held it near the candlelight, squinting slightly. "You always did write your J's like that," she said to my father. The observation was almost casual, but devastating. My father reached across the table suddenly and took the paper from her hand. "That's enough," he said. His voice had sharpened again. The authority was back, but it felt different now. Less stable, more desperate. "Julia," he said, looking directly at me, "if you have concerns about financial records, you should have brought them to us privately." I met his gaze. I did. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Because that part was true. 6 years earlier, I had brought the bank letters home and asked them what had happened. And 6 years earlier, my father had sighed heavily and explained that young people often misunderstood complicated financial decisions made for their benefit. That conversation had lasted 20 minutes. The debt had lasted years. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again. "Actually, Miss Parker did contact the bank multiple times, requesting clarification," he said. My father's head turned toward him sharply. The investigator continued calmly. "And those inquiries are part of the reason the account was reviewed during a broader audit earlier this year." Audit. Another word that sounds harmless until people realize what it actually involves. Files reopened, documents compared, signatures examined. Across the table, Serena's voice came out almost as a whisper. "So the bank thinks the signature isn't Julia's." Mr. Hargreaves nodded slightly. "Handwriting analysis suggests the signature matches another known sample more closely." My father slammed the paper down on the table. "Enough." The sound echoed through the room. Several guests flinched. But the authority behind the gesture had already begun to crumble. Because anger does not erase ink. Moira leaned back in her chair. "I remember when you helped Julia fill out her university forms," she said thoughtfully. Everyone turned toward her. "You were very proud of how organized everything was." My father stared at her. Moira continued calmly. "You insisted on keeping copies of everything." Her eyes drifted to the folder beside my hand, then to my father again. "I suppose those copies would still exist somewhere." My father's face had gone pale now, because Moira had just pointed to the real danger. Records, not opinions, not family memory, actual documentation. My mother tried again, her voice tight with strain. This entire conversation is inappropriate," she said. "We are here to remember Julia's grandmother. Her attempt at emotional redirection might have worked earlier in the evening, but now the room had shifted too far." Elliot spoke quietly. "If the loans were taken out without Julia's knowledge, that's not really a family disagreement." Mr. Hargreaves finished the thought. "That becomes identity fraud." The words landed like cold metal on the table. Identity fraud. No one moved. My father looked at me again, and for the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Because the power he had relied on for decades, the ability to control the narrative, had finally encountered something stronger. Documentation. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to explain. But before he could speak, Serena asked the question that changed the entire direction of the room. Why would anyone take a loan in Julia's name in the first place? The question was not accusatory, it was logical. And logic has a terrible habit of dismantling stories built on emotion. My father closed his mouth again. Across the room, the investigator watched quietly, because now the conversation was no longer about signatures, it was about motive. And motives are much harder to explain once the documents are already on the table. Part 9. When Serena asked why anyone would take a loan in my name, the room did something strange. It leaned inward. Not physically, not all at once, but the collective attention shifted toward the center of the table as if gravity itself had moved there. For years, my parents had controlled conversations through tone and timing. They steered questions away before anyone could ask them fully. But Serena had asked the one question that narrative alone could not answer. Motive. Across from me, Graham rubbed a hand over his mouth. That's ridiculous, he muttered. Nobody would do that. His voice carried less confidence than usual, because even he could see the signatures, and because the presence of Mr. Hargreaves had transformed the situation from family tension into something far more dangerous. My father finally spoke again. There's no motive, he said sharply. The loan was arranged to help Julia manage her expenses after university. His voice carried the tone he used when delivering final answers. In the past, that tone alone had been enough to shut down further discussion. But tonight, people were already comparing the explanation with the documents. Serena looked at me. Did you ask them to take a loan for you? She asked. I shook my head. No. Elliot frowned. Did you even know about it? Not until the bank called me years later. Several people shifted uncomfortably. The story was beginning to rearrange itself in their minds. My mother leaned forward quickly. Julia was overwhelmed during that period, she said. She had just started her career, and we handled some of the financial details for her convenience. Handled. Another gentle word for something far more complicated. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again. If I may clarify something, he said calmly. No one interrupted him. The loan consolidation application required several forms of identification, including a copy of Miss Parker's university records and personal information. His eyes moved slowly around the table. Access to those documents would have been limited. Limited. The implication hung quietly in the air. My father crossed his arms. Parents often assist their children with paperwork, he said. Yes, Mr. Hargreaves agreed. But assisting with paperwork does not usually involve signing their name. A faint ripple of nervous laughter moved along one side of the table. It died quickly, because the sentence had landed too close to the truth. Moira reached for the page again, studying the signatures with a scholar's patience. You always had very neat handwriting, she said to my father. I remember you teaching Graham to write his name properly when he was little. Graham shifted in his chair. Moira looked back at the page. The loops are almost identical. My father's patience snapped slightly. Handwriting similarities proved nothing. Mr. Hargreaves nodded politely. On their own, no. But when combined with timeline discrepancies and document access records, they become quite significant. Timeline, access, records. The conversation had left emotional territory completely now. My mother stood up again. This is harassment, she said, but the word sounded hollow, because no one in the room had raised their voice. The investigator remained calm. No harassment is intended, Mrs. Parker. Our review simply requires us to verify how the application was submitted. Across the table, Serena whispered something I almost didn't hear. When was the loan approved? Mr. Hargreaves answered immediately. 8 months after Miss Parker graduated. Serena's eyes moved slowly to my father. And where was Julia living then? In Glasgow, Elliot said quietly. Working. The room had begun assembling the puzzle. My father saw it happening, which is why his next move was predictable. Enough speculation, he said firmly. This conversation ends now. He reached toward the folder as if to close it. I placed my hand over it first. The movement was calm, not aggressive, just enough to stop him. No, I said. The word was quiet, but final. For a second, the room held its breath. My father looked down at my hand on the folder, then back at my face. "You think embarrassing your family in public will solve anything?" he said. His voice carried the first hint of desperation. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I slid another document from the folder. Not a bank statement, not a signature comparison. This one looked even more ordinary. A printed email, dated 6 years earlier. I placed it beside the signatures. My father recognized it instantly, because it had come from his own address. Across the table, Elliot leaned forward again. "What's that?" I spoke calmly. "The first email I sent my parents after the bank called." The room went quiet again, because now the timeline had witnesses. I watched my father read the subject line. "Loan documents. I don't understand this." My mother's voice cracked. "Julia," I continued. "In that email, I asked if either of you knew why the bank believed I had taken out a loan consolidation." Several people leaned closer to see the page. Elliot read the timestamp. "You sent this the same day the bank called?" "Yes." Serena whispered, "What did they say?" I looked at my father. For years, that email had sat unanswered in a digital archive, but I had printed it, because unanswered questions leave traces. My father did not speak. My mother finally said something. We assumed it was a misunderstanding. Moira tilted her head. "Did you tell Julia that?" No one answered, because the email chain on the page showed something else. Silence. Days passed, then weeks. No reply. Graham leaned closer. "You never answered her?" My father's voice was colder now. There was nothing to answer. "The bank's records said otherwise," I replied. Mr. Hargreaves nodded slightly. "Yes, because the loan payments had already begun." Another quiet shock moved through the table. "Payments?" Elliot asked. Mr. Hargreaves explained calmly. "Yes, monthly payments were scheduled to begin shortly after the loan was approved." Serena looked confused. "But if Julia didn't know about the loan," I finished the sentence. "Then someone else must have been managing the account." Every head turned toward my father, because suddenly the motive Serena asked about earlier had become clearer. Loans create debt. Debt requires payments, and someone had been paying them. My father's silence was no longer authority. It was exposure. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again. "Our review shows the first payments were made from an account linked to the Parker household." The words settled over the room like frost. Graham's eyes widened. "Dad?" But my father did not look at him. He was staring at the documents, calculating again, because the room had crossed a point where explanations needed more than confidence. They needed facts. And the next document in my folder was about to remove the last piece of protection he had left, the assumption that no one had actually checked where the money came from. Part 10. If the earlier moments had cracked the room open, the next one began to rearrange the entire structure of the table. Until now, people had still been clinging to a fragile possibility that this was all some misunderstanding, some complicated financial decision that had simply been communicated poorly years ago. Families are very good at believing that explanation. It allows everyone to leave the room without deciding who is responsible. But misunderstandings rarely come with payment records. The document in my hand was thin, almost unimpressive. Just a printed page from the bank's internal review. Columns of numbers, dates, account identifiers, nothing dramatic. And yet it carried more weight than every emotional argument my parents had ever made. I placed it beside the earlier pages. Elliot leaned closer first, reading automatically the way accountants and engineers do when numbers appear in front of them. His eyebrows rose slowly. "These payments," he said quietly. He glanced up at Mr. Hargreaves. "They're not from Julia's account." The investigator nodded. "Correct." The room waited. Elliot continued scanning the page. Then he looked up again. "They're from," he hesitated slightly, "from your father's." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Earlier, people had been processing the idea of a forged signature. Now they were confronting something more complicated, because the payments suggested responsibility, not just deception. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. "That proves nothing," he said. His voice had returned to its controlled register again, but the effort behind it was visible now. Parents sometimes help their children with financial obligations. A few relatives nodded instinctively. The explanation sounded reasonable, but only until Serena asked the next question. If you were helping Julia pay the loan, why didn't you tell her about it? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. The answer should have been simple, because helpful gestures are usually announced proudly. Instead, the table received silence. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again, his tone still maddeningly calm. There's another detail the bank noticed during the audit. He reached toward the document and tapped one of the columns lightly. These payments stopped abruptly after 3 years. Graham frowned. Why? The investigator looked at him briefly. Because the account changed. Changed? Elliot asked. Yes, the payments began coming directly from Miss Parker's account. Several people turned toward me. Serena's eyes widened. You started paying the loan? I nodded. Yes. The room shifted again, because the timeline was becoming painfully clear. My father made the first payments. Then at some point, the responsibility transferred quietly to me, without explanation, without discussion, without permission. My cousin Margaret spoke slowly, but if Julia didn't know about the loan at first, how did the payments end up coming from her account later? I answered before Mr. Hargreaves could. The bank contacted me again 3 years later when the payment account changed. I looked at the table. They told me the loan was already in my name and that the payments needed to continue. My mother shook her head immediately. That must have been another misunderstanding. The room did not move with her this time, because misunderstandings rarely last 3 years. Moira looked at my father thoughtfully. 3 years is a long time to help someone with a debt they don't know exists. My father's voice hardened. We were protecting her. From what? Serena asked. The question cut through the room like glass. My father looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. From financial stress, he said. Serena blinked. So instead you created debt in her name? No one laughed, because the logic was too clean. My father pushed his chair back slightly again. You're twisting the situation, he said. Mr. Hargreaves shook his head gently. Actually, the situation is fairly straightforward from the bank's perspective. He glanced at the signatures again. A loan was approved under Miss Parker's name. Payments were made from another account initially. Then the responsibility shifted to her without explanation. He paused. Those circumstances raise certain legal questions. The phrase settled heavily across the table. My mother's composure was visibly crumbling now. This is absurd, she said again, but her voice sounded thinner each time she repeated the word. Graham looked from the documents to my father. Dad, did you sign those papers? The question hung in the air. Direct. Unavoidable. For years, Graham had avoided asking anything that might complicate his comfortable position in the family, but now the evidence was lying openly on the table. My father's eyes moved slowly around the room. Cousins, relatives, his wife, his son, the investigator, and finally me. Then he said something unexpected. This entire matter was handled for Julia's benefit. The room did not accept the explanation this time, because benefit usually involves consent. Moira leaned forward slightly. Did Julia agree to the loan? My father said nothing. My mother looked at him. Answer them. The words came out almost like a plea. He inhaled again. No. The single syllable settled over the room. Graham's chair creaked. Serena closed her eyes briefly. Elliot stared at the page. Because now the situation had moved from suspicion to confirmation. My father had admitted the loan existed without my agreement, but he had not yet explained why, and motive still sat quietly in the center of the table. Serena spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that? This time, my father did not answer immediately, because now the truth required something even more uncomfortable than admitting the signature. It required explaining the decision. And somewhere inside that explanation was a detail my parents had carefully avoided mentioning for years. A detail connected to Graham. And the reason the loan had been taken in my name instead of someone else's. Part 11. The moment Serena asked why, the room reached a kind of suspended stillness. Up until then, the conversation had been about mechanics, signatures, documents, payments, technical things people could examine like parts of a machine. But motive was different. Motive required intention. It required someone to explain the thinking behind the action. And explanations are dangerous when witnesses are present. My father remained standing beside his chair, one hand resting on the polished wood of the table. The candlelight flickered across the side of his face, catching the tension along his jaw. For the first time in my life, I could see him calculating without confidence, because the explanation he had relied on privately for years would sound very different when spoken aloud in front of the entire family. Graham shifted beside Serena. "Dad," he said again. My father looked at him slowly. "You were under pressure at the time," he said. The sentence was vague enough that several people frowned. "Under pressure how?" Serena asked quietly. My father hesitated. Then he said the name, Graham. The room moved slightly, not physically, but mentally. Attention pivoted toward my brother. Graham blinked. "What does this have to do with me?" My father exhaled slowly. "You had already taken out loans for your business venture that year." Graham's expression tightened. "That's normal for a startup." "Yes," my father replied. "But the bank had begun reviewing your accounts more closely." Across the table, Elliot frowned. "Because of the debt ratio?" My father nodded reluctantly. Yes, the explanation was beginning to take shape. Several people at the table had enough financial experience to understand what that meant. Banks become cautious when someone accumulates too much risk, which meant another loan under Graham's name would have drawn attention. Serena's eyes widened slightly. "So, you couldn't put another loan under Graham's name?" No one answered immediately, but the silence answered the question. Moira leaned back slowly in her chair. "Ah," she murmured. The sound carried decades of quiet understanding. My cousin Margaret spoke carefully. "But why Julia?" My father looked at me. "Because she had no debt." The simplicity of the answer struck the room like a quiet hammer. No debt, clean credit history. A recent university graduate with excellent records, the perfect financial profile. My mother stepped forward quickly. "We always intended to handle the payments ourselves," she said. The familiar word returned again. Intended. But intentions do not erase signatures. Serena looked stunned. "You used Julia's name because the bank wouldn't approve another loan for Graham?" My father did not answer directly. Instead, he said something that revealed more than he realized. It was a temporary solution. Temporary. 6 years of debt. 3 years of secret payments. And then the responsibility quietly transferred to me. My brother's voice had gone quiet now. "I didn't know about that." The room turned toward him. My father's eyes flickered. Graham continued. "You told me the bank had approved another family-backed loan." Serena stared at him. "You thought it was in your name?" Graham nodded slowly. "That's what I was told." For the first time that evening, my father looked genuinely unsettled, because the explanation he had been constructing was now developing new complications. My cousin Elliot rubbed his forehead. "Wait." He pointed toward the documents. "So, the loan was taken out under Julia's name, but the money actually went to support Graham's business?" My father said nothing. Mr. Hargreaves spoke gently. "The transaction records do show a transfer to a business account associated with Mr. Graham Parker shortly after the loan was approved." Graham's face drained of color. "You used Julia's credit for my investment?" The sentence sounded less like anger and more like disbelief. My mother stepped forward again. "It was family support," she insisted. But the room had already moved beyond that language, because family support usually involves conversation, consent, transparency. What had happened here involved none of those things. Moira looked at my father calmly. "Did Julia know her name was being used?" "No." "Did Graham know the loan was in Julia's name?" "Apparently not." Moira folded her hands neatly on the table. "Then, I'm afraid that's not family support. That's fraud." My mother flinched. "You can't say that." Moira raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The word fraud hung in the air again. Mr. Hargreaves did not interrupt this time. He simply observed. Because the family itself was now articulating the problem. Serena looked at Graham. Did the business even succeed? Graham hesitated. For a moment, the answer seemed uncertain. Then he sighed. No. Another quiet shock moved through the table. Because now the situation looked even worse. The loan had been taken under my name. The money had funded Graham's failing venture, and when the payments had eventually shifted to me, the business was already gone. Elliot leaned back in his chair. So Julia ended up paying for a business she didn't know existed. My father spoke again, his voice strained now. We handled the payments for years. Until you stopped, I said. He looked at me. Yes. Why? Because the business collapsed, Graham answered quietly. The admission came from him, not my father, which somehow made it more devastating. Serena covered her mouth. My father's voice grew defensive. We assumed Julia was capable of managing the payments by then. I almost laughed. The room did not, because everyone understood what that sentence really meant. When the situation became inconvenient, the responsibility had been quietly transferred to me. Moira nodded slowly. Ah, the scapegoat stage. The phrase was soft, but brutally accurate. For years, the family system had functioned by assigning one person the role of absorbing the consequences. Me. Now that role was being exposed under candlelight in front of witnesses. My father looked around the table again. You're all exaggerating this situation, he said. But no one rushed to agree, because now the narrative had collapsed into something simpler. A forged signature, a loan taken without consent, money transferred to another child, debt quietly reassigned. Mr. Hargreaves finally spoke again. From the bank's perspective, he said calmly, the issue is straightforward. Miss Parker's identity was used to obtain a loan she did not authorize. He paused, and the funds were transferred elsewhere. My mother whispered something under her breath, but my father was staring at the documents again. Because the problem had grown beyond embarrassment. This was no longer about family reputation, it was about legal liability. And somewhere inside the folder beside my hand was the final piece that would make that liability impossible to ignore. The investigator had asked me to bring it tonight, not because the bank needed it, but because sometimes the fastest way to end a story built on manipulation is to place the final document where everyone can see it, right in the middle of the table. Part 12. By the time the conversation reached the point where the word fraud had been spoken aloud twice, the room had stopped pretending this was still a memorial gathering. The candles still burned. The plates still sat neatly arranged on the table. But the social structure of the evening had collapsed. No one cared about dessert anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the documents spread across the white linen like quiet pieces of evidence. My father had finally sat down again, though the posture of authority he usually carried with him had vanished. His shoulders looked slightly lower now, as if the weight of the room's attention had settled onto them. Across from him, Graham had gone pale. Serena's hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Moira watched the entire scene with the calm patience of someone who had spent decades observing family dynamics and had long ago stopped being surprised by the ways people tried to protect themselves. And in the corner of the room, Mr. Hargreaves waited. He had not taken control of the conversation. He didn't need to. The truth was already doing the work for him. Elliot spoke first. So the loan funded Graham's business, he said slowly, as if assembling the situation piece by piece. And when the business collapsed, the payments moved to Julia. Graham looked down at the table. I didn't know it was her loan, he said again. His voice sounded smaller now. Serena turned toward him. But you knew your parents were paying something off. He nodded reluctantly. They said it was a family-backed investment loan. Moira lifted one eyebrow. Family-backed. The phrase seemed to amuse her slightly. That's certainly one way to describe it. My mother pressed a hand against her temple. We did what we thought was necessary at the time, she said. Necessary. Another word that sounded weaker every time it was used. Necessary for whom? Serena asked quietly. My mother did not answer. My father spoke instead. The situation was temporary, he repeated. Julia was doing well by then. The logic was almost fascinating, as if my success somehow justified the deception. As if financial stability meant consent could be ignored. I looked at him calmly. You could have asked. He didn't reply, because the answer to that sentence was obvious. If they had asked, I would have said no, and that would have ended Graham's business before it even began. Across the table, Margaret shook her head slowly. I still don't understand something. Everyone looked at her. If the bank required Julia's signature, how did they accept the application without confirming it? Mr. Hargreaves answered. The application was submitted with supporting documents that appeared legitimate. He gestured lightly toward the pages, including identification records and previous signature samples. My father's gaze hardened. Are you suggesting the bank is incapable of verifying its own paperwork? The investigator did not take the bait. Banks verify thousands of documents every week, he said calmly. Most applications are legitimate. Then he added quietly, the system depends on the assumption that people submitting those documents are acting honestly. The sentence landed with quiet finality, because now the issue was no longer technical. It was ethical. Moira looked at my father again. You always did say integrity mattered. My father did not respond. The room had grown noticeably colder, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, because the conversation had moved beyond explanation. Now everyone was waiting for something else. Consequences. Serena finally asked the question that had been hovering in the air since Mr. Hargreaves arrived. What happens now? The investigator looked toward her. That depends on several factors. He glanced briefly at the documents. If the bank determines the loan was obtained through identity fraud, responsibility for the debt can shift back to the individual who submitted the application. The words were spoken gently, but their meaning was unmistakable. My father's head snapped up. That's absurd, is it? Mr. Hargreaves replied. My mother looked horrified. You can't just rewrite 6 years of payments. Actually, the investigator said calmly, banks do that quite often when fraud is confirmed. Across the table, Graham swallowed hard. Dad, my father stared at him. This is being exaggerated, but even he no longer sounded convinced. Because the room had witnesses now. Not just family members who might choose silence later, but an investigator. Hotel staff. A gathering of people who had heard the explanation with their own ears. Moira reached forward again and tapped the leather folder beside my hand. You mentioned earlier that you brought documents. I nodded. Yes, the room leaned closer again, because everyone sensed that the story was not finished yet. My father watched the folder carefully. Whatever else is in there, he said, this conversation should stop. I opened the folder again. Inside were still several papers, but the one I removed next looked different from the others. It wasn't a bank document, it was older. A photocopy of a form from my final year at university. The title at the top read, Parental Financial Access Authorization. My father recognized it instantly, because he had signed it years earlier. When I trusted him to help manage scholarship paperwork, I placed the page beside the others. This form allowed my father temporary access to my university financial records, I said. Elliot read the heading. Temporary? Yes. Serena leaned closer. When did it expire? I pointed to the date. 3 months after graduation. The room went still again, because the loan application had been submitted 8 months later. 5 months after my father's authorization ended. Moira nodded slowly. So he no longer had permission to access your financial information. Correct. Mr. Hargreaves spoke quietly, which means any documents obtained after that date would not have been authorized. My father's hands tightened on the edge of the table. This is being taken completely out of context. But the context was sitting directly in front of everyone. A permission form, an expiration date, A loan application submitted months later. Serena whispered something under her breath. My mother looked desperately at my father. Say something. But this time there was nothing left to say, because the final piece of the timeline had just fallen into place, and everyone at the table could now see exactly when the decision had been made. Not during my university years, not while I was still living at home, but months after I had already built my own life in another city, when my father no longer had permission, and when my name was simply the most convenient one to use. The silence that followed was heavy enough that even the candles seemed to burn more slowly. And then Mr. Hargreaves asked the question that would turn the situation from family scandal into something far more serious. "Mr. Parker," he said gently, "do you recall submitting this loan application yourself?" Part 13. The question did not sound aggressive. Mr. Hargreaves asked it the way someone might ask whether a form had been mailed or a receipt misplaced. His tone carried no accusation, no raised edge of authority. If anything, it was almost courteous. But courtesy can be terrifying when the facts are already visible on the table. "Do you recall submitting this loan application yourself?" The room waited. My father's hand remained on the edge of the table, fingers curled against the linen as though he were gripping something invisible. For a long moment, he did not look at the investigator. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on the authorization form I had placed beside the other documents. Temporary access. Expired 5 months before the loan appeared. Even someone with no legal training could see the shape of the timeline now. Across the table, Graham looked as if someone had just tilted the ground beneath his chair. Serena had stopped blinking entirely. Moira's expression was the same patient calm she had worn since the beginning of the evening, but now there was something else there as well. Recognition. Because she had seen systems like this before. Families often run on invisible agreements, roles assigned quietly over years. One person becomes the reliable one. Another becomes the charming one, and occasionally someone becomes the one expected to absorb consequences no one else wants. Tonight, the system had been dragged into daylight. My father finally lifted his eyes. He did not answer the question. Instead, he said something else. "This conversation is finished." His voice had hardened again, but the authority behind it felt thinner now, like a coat worn through at the elbows. Mr. Hargreaves did not move. "Mr. Parker," he repeated calmly, "do you recall submitting the loan application?" My father's jaw tightened. "You're attempting to turn a family decision into a criminal matter." The investigator tilted his head slightly. "Identity misuse involving financial documents is already a criminal matter." The words were not spoken loudly. They didn't need to be. My mother made a small sound in the back of her throat. Something halfway between a protest and a breath that had gone wrong. "That's not what happened," she said quickly. Everyone turned toward her. She looked suddenly fragile, standing beside the table, one hand gripping the back of her chair. "We were trying to help our children," she said. Moira's voice drifted across the table like a quiet breeze. "Both of them?" My mother hesitated. The question had landed exactly where it needed to, because the loan had helped one child and burdened the other. Graham shifted in his seat. "Mom," he said quietly. Serena looked at him again. "Did you know any of this?" He shook his head slowly. "No." The word sounded genuine, which made the entire situation even more disturbing, because it meant the deception had been carefully managed. My father spoke again, trying to regain control of the narrative. "The money was used to support a family venture," he said. Elliot frowned. "But the loan was in Julia's name." My father's patience snapped again, because Julia had the cleanest credit history. The admission fell out of him like a loose stone. He seemed to realize the mistake immediately afterward, but it was too late. The sentence hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. "You used her credit because it looked better to the bank." Serena said the words slowly. My father did not respond, because denial now required ignoring his own explanation. Mr. Hargreaves made a small note in the notebook he had taken from his pocket, just a quick movement of his pen. But the sound of the paper shifting seemed to echo in the quiet room. "What are you writing?" my father demanded. "Merely documenting statements made during this conversation," the investigator replied. "You can't do that." "Actually, I can." The politeness never left his voice. Across the table, Margaret looked deeply uncomfortable. "This is getting serious," she murmured. Moira nodded faintly. "It was always serious." Serena leaned forward again. "But if the bank already has the documents, why come here tonight?" The question was directed toward Mr. Hargreaves, but I answered instead, "Because the bank wanted to confirm something." Everyone looked at me. "What?" Elliot asked. I reached into the folder again. The document I removed this time looked almost sentimental, old. The paper slightly yellowed. It was a photocopy of a birthday card. The room blinked collectively. My father frowned. "What is that supposed to prove?" I placed the card on the table and opened it. Inside was a short message written in blue ink, my father's handwriting. Serena leaned closer. "Why a birthday card?" Mr. Hargreaves answered quietly. "Because handwriting samples are often easiest to verify in informal writing." The room went still again, because the handwriting in the card was unmistakable. The same loops, the same pressure marks, the same hesitation in the curve of the final letter, exactly like the signature on the loan. My father stared at the card. "Where did you get that?" "You gave it to me." The sentence felt strangely calm leaving my mouth. "My 21st birthday." Moira smiled faintly. "You always did write long messages in those cards." My father looked around the table again. Faces that had once nodded along with his stories were now studying the handwriting with quiet scrutiny. The room had become a courtroom without realizing it, because evidence had a way of rearranging relationships. Serena whispered something. "It's the same handwriting." Graham rubbed his forehead. "Jesus." My mother sank slowly back into her chair. She began. But the sentence dissolved before it reached the end. Mr. Hargreaves spoke once more. "Mr. Parker," he said calmly, "if you submitted the application using Miss Parker's identity, the bank will need a formal statement from you." The word formal hung heavily. My father's eyes moved between the card, the signatures, the investigator. For the first time all evening, the calculation in his face looked different, not strategic, cornered. Because the evidence no longer belonged only to the bank, it belonged to the room. Relatives, witnesses, people who would remember exactly how the story unfolded tonight. My father finally said something, very quietly. "You're destroying this family." The accusation drifted across the table. I looked at him. "No," I said, "the truth did that." And somewhere behind us, a waiter quietly placed the untouched dessert plates on the sideboard, because the evening was still continuing. But the real meal, the one built from years of manipulation, had finally been served. Part 14. For several seconds after I said the truth did that, no one spoke. The sentence settled into the room like dust after a collapsed ceiling. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Around the table, faces that had once smiled politely through my parents' version of events were now rearranging themselves into something closer to understanding. And understanding is rarely comfortable. The desserts the staff had quietly placed along the sideboard remained untouched. A neat line of small chocolate tortes, lemon tarts, and porcelain spoons sat beneath the warm glow of the wall lamps, waiting for an appetite that no longer existed. Because the real hunger in the room had shifted. People wanted answers. My father remained seated, staring at the birthday card and the signatures as if the ink itself had betrayed him. His hands were flat on the table now, palms pressing into the linen like someone bracing against unseen current. My mother sat beside him, visibly shrinking into the chair she had chosen earlier with such careful dignity. Her earlier composure, the gentle sadness of a grieving daughter hosting a memorial gathering, had evaporated entirely. Now she looked tired and frightened. Graham spoke first. His voice sounded raw. "Dad, why didn't you just tell me?" The question hung awkwardly in the air, because it revealed something everyone had begun to suspect but had not yet said out loud. Graham had not asked for the loan to be taken in my name. He had believed the money was arranged legitimately. My father's eyes flicked toward him. "You were already under enough pressure," he said. Graham frowned. "That doesn't explain using Julia's identity." My father's silence stretched long enough that Serena finally answered the question herself. "Because the bank wouldn't approve another loan for you." Her voice was soft, but the clarity of it cut straight through the room. Graham leaned back in his chair slowly. "So you used her credit." My father did not deny it, which in that moment said more than any confession could have. Moira folded her hands on the table. "The curious thing about scapegoats," she said mildly, "is that families often assume they'll never stop carrying the blame." Everyone turned toward her. Moira continued in the same calm tone she might have used to discuss weather patterns. "The system works until the scapegoat grows up." A faint, uncomfortable ripple moved around the table, because the word scapegoat had been spoken openly now, not whispered, not implied, named. My mother's voice returned suddenly, brittle with emotion. "Julia was always difficult," she said. Several heads turned toward her in surprise. The sentence had arrived out of nowhere, or rather, it had arrived from the past, because it was the argument she had used for years. If Julia had simply been more cooperative, if Julia had trusted her parents' judgment, if Julia had stayed closer to the family, then none of this would have become a problem. The familiar narrative tried to reassemble itself in the air, but this time it collapsed before it could stand. Serena spoke first. "Difficult?" She gestured lightly toward the documents. "She's been paying a loan she didn't even know about for years." My mother's mouth opened, closed again. Elliot leaned forward. "How much was the loan?" The question was practical, direct. I answered, "Just over £60,000. Several people inhaled sharply. The number sounded heavier spoken aloud than it ever had printed on bank statements. Graham looked stunned. "60,000? My father's voice returned with sudden force. "We paid the first 3 years of it." "That's not the point," Serena said quietly. The room agreed with her in silence, because the issue had never been about who made the first payments. It was about consent. Mr. Hargreaves finally spoke again. "The bank's interest is determining who authorized the application," he said calmly. His eyes moved toward my father, and whether Miss Parker's identity was used without permission. My father stood again abruptly. "This is absurd," but the word had lost its strength. No one looked persuaded. Margaret spoke carefully. "If the bank decides it was fraud, what happens?" Mr. Hargreaves answered with the same steady tone he had used all evening. "The loan can be reassigned to the person who submitted the application." My mother looked horrified. "Even after 6 years?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Across the table, Graham stared at the papers again. That would mean he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because everyone could see where the responsibility would land. My father's breathing had grown heavier now. "You're all enjoying this far too much," he said. No one responded, because no one looked like they were enjoying anything. Serena shook her head slowly. "I don't think anyone here is enjoying it." She glanced at me briefly, but it needed to happen. The room seemed to agree again, not with words, with silence. My father looked at me once more. "You could have come to us privately," he repeated. The argument sounded weaker now. "I did," I reminded him quietly. 6 years ago." The email still lay on the table beside the documents, unanswered. Moira nodded faintly. "Yes. I remember that period. You seemed quite confident it was all a misunderstanding." My father's lips pressed together. Mr. Hargreaves closed his notebook gently. "The bank will continue its review regardless of tonight's conversation," he said. "But I appreciate the clarification." Clarification. Such a polite word for a family collapse. My mother suddenly looked toward the doorway as if noticing the rest of the world again. There were still hotel staff standing nearby, guests from other rooms walking past the corridor outside. The private drama she had spent years controlling was no longer private. "Julia," she said softly. The tone had changed again, not defensive, almost pleading. "What do you want from us?" For a moment, I didn't answer, because the question carried more weight than the documents. People often assume confrontations are about revenge, about humiliation, about winning. But what I wanted had nothing to do with that. I looked around the table, at Serena's steady gaze, at Graham's stunned silence, at Moira's quiet approval, at the investigator standing patiently near the wall. Then I looked back at my parents. "I want the truth on record." The sentence was simple, but it carried a consequence my father had spent years avoiding. Because once the truth was written down, in bank files and statements and legal documents, it would stop being a family story. It would become history. And history cannot be rewritten just because it becomes inconvenient. My father understood that immediately, which is why the next thing he said would shift the room once again. Because instead of denying the signature, he began explaining exactly how the application had been submitted. Part 15. My father did not raise his voice when he began to explain. If anything, he sounded calmer than he had at any point since the investigator stepped into the room. The anger had drained away, replaced by something colder, something that felt less like denial and more like calculation. Because now he understood what everyone else at the table was beginning to understand. The story had reached a point where pretending nothing happened would only make things worse. So instead, he chose a different strategy. He began to talk. "Very well," he said slowly, looking around the table as if addressing a boardroom rather than a family gathering. "Since everyone seems determined to dissect a decision made years ago, I suppose it deserves context." No one interrupted him. Even Mr. Hargreaves remained silent. My father rested his hands on the table, his posture straightening slightly as he spoke. Graham's business was already underway when the bank began reviewing his credit exposure, he said. Investors had committed funds, contracts were in discussion, and pulling support at that stage would have caused considerable damage. Graham looked up. Damage to whom? To the entire family's financial position, my father replied. Serena frowned. How? Because our name was already attached to the project. The sentence landed heavily. For my father, reputation had always been currency. Business reputation, social reputation, family reputation. They all lived in the same fragile ecosystem, and that ecosystem apparently had been worth £60,000. So instead of canceling the loan, Elliot said slowly, "You moved it." My father nodded once, to Julia's credit profile. The bluntness of the admission made several people shift in their chairs. My mother looked down at the table. She had clearly not expected the explanation to arrive quite so directly. Serena spoke quietly, without asking her. My father's eyes flicked toward me. "We intended to handle the payments ourselves." "You did," I said. "For 3 years." My father gave a small nod. "Yes, then you stopped because Graham's business collapsed." Graham rubbed his temples. It wasn't supposed to collapse. No one answered him, because the collapse itself was not the real issue. The deception was. My father continued speaking, his tone almost clinical now. At the time, it seemed like the least harmful solution. The phrase echoed strangely through the room. Least harmful. Moira tilted her head. Least harmful for whom? My father did not respond immediately, because the answer was obvious. Graham, not me. Serena said it aloud. "You protected one child by risking the other." My father's expression hardened slightly. Julia was always capable. That sentence carried a familiar weight. For years it had been used as praise. But tonight it sounded different, because capability had been used as justification. She was strong enough to carry it. So we let her. I looked at him calmly. "You didn't let me. You assigned it." The room fell quiet again. Across the table, Graham looked at me with something close to guilt now. "I honestly didn't know," he said. "I believe you." And I did. That was the strange part. Graham had been many things over the years, self-absorbed, careless, occasionally arrogant, but he had never been particularly deceptive. The system had protected him too well for that. My father cleared his throat. The situation evolved, he said. Serena almost laughed. Evolved? The word sounded absurd in the middle of a room full of evidence. Yes, the loan became Julia's responsibility once she had established her career. I leaned slightly forward. You mean once the business was gone? My father said nothing. Mr. Hargreaves finally spoke again. Mr. Parker, from the bank's perspective, intention does not change authorization requirements. My father looked irritated. I'm aware of that. Are you? Moira asked softly. The room held its breath, because for the first time that evening, someone had openly challenged his authority without hesitation. My father ignored her. We plan to tell Julia eventually, he said. Eventually, 6 years later. Serena shook her head slowly. You mean when she had already paid half of it? Graham's voice returned, strained. How much has she paid? I answered quietly. 23,000. Graham closed his eyes briefly. Jesus. My mother whispered something under her breath, but my father remained focused on the investigator now. What exactly does the bank intend to do? Mr. Hargreaves answered carefully. The review will determine whether the loan should be reassigned. My father's jaw tightened. You mean to me, potentially. The calm answer seemed to echo in the room. My mother looked horrified again. That would ruin us. Moira raised an eyebrow. Interesting. My father turned sharply toward her. What is that supposed to mean? She met his gaze without blinking. You didn't worry about ruin when the debt belonged to Julia. The room went completely still, because the logic was undeniable. For 6 years, the financial risk had existed. It had simply belonged to someone else. My father looked back at the investigator. This is becoming ridiculous. But the words sounded exhausted now, because every argument had already been answered by the documents on the table. Mr. Hargreaves closed his notebook. As I said earlier, the bank's process will continue regardless of tonight's conversation. He paused. But statements made in front of witnesses often help clarify responsibility. Witnesses. The word carried weight, because suddenly the room was not just family anymore. It was a record. Every person present had heard the explanation, the motive, the admission. My father understood that, which is why his next words changed the atmosphere again. Because instead of defending himself further, he looked directly at me and asked the question he should have asked 6 years earlier. Julia, he said quietly, what exactly do you intend to do now? The room waited for my answer, because whatever I said next would decide whether this evening ended as a family confrontation or something far more permanent. Part 16. The room waited. It was not the polite silence of a family gathering anymore. This was something heavier, more deliberate, the kind of stillness that settles over a courtroom when someone realizes the next answer will determine where the responsibility lands. Julia, he had asked, what exactly do you intend to do now? For a moment, I let the question sit in the air, because 6 years earlier, when the bank first called, I had spent months imagining this exact moment. Back then, the fantasy had been emotional. I had imagined shouting, confrontations, dramatic confessions where everyone finally understood what had been done to me. But time changes the shape of anger. Years of carrying someone else's debt had worn the emotion down into something much calmer, much sharper. Across the table, Graham watched me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not confidence, not irritation, something closer to regret. Serena sat perfectly still beside him, her eyes fixed on me as if she already knew the answer mattered more than anything that had happened so far. Moira leaned back in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked almost serene, because she had already seen the system break. The rest of the room was simply catching up. My father was still standing. The authority he had worn all evening like armor had begun to show cracks, but the instinct behind it remained. He was used to controlling outcomes, even when circumstances turned against him. He expected this question to produce negotiation, compromise, perhaps even mercy. I looked at him, then I looked at the documents spread across the table, the loan agreement, the signature comparisons, the expired authorization form, the payment records, and finally the birthday card with his handwriting. 6 years of quiet manipulation had been reduced to a handful of pages. It almost felt anticlimactic. What do I intend to do? I repeated, yes. His voice sounded steady again now, because he believed the decision still belonged to me. Technically, it did. The bank could continue its investigation regardless of what happened tonight, but formal statements, witness accounts, and cooperation often influenced how quickly those processes moved. In other words, the room had become a crossroads. I closed the folder slowly. The soft sound of leather against paper seemed louder than it should have. Then I said something my father clearly did not expect. Nothing. The word drifted across the table. He blinked. Nothing? Yes. Serena frowned slightly. What do you mean, nothing? I folded my hands calmly. I mean, I'm not here to punish anyone. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Even Mr. Hargreaves looked mildly surprised. My father narrowed his eyes. Then, why bring all this? The answer was simple. Because the truth had to exist somewhere outside your version of events. The sentence landed gently, but its weight was unmistakable. For years, my parents had controlled the story. Every holiday dinner, every family photo, every conversation about my supposed independence had quietly reinforced the idea that I had distanced myself from the family out of stubborn pride. Now the real reason sat on the table. Documentation had replaced narrative. Moira smiled faintly. Yes, she said softly. That does change things. My father crossed his arms. If you're not pursuing anything, what was the point of this spectacle? Spectacle. The word might have irritated me once. Now it simply sounded defensive. I gestured lightly toward the room, because everyone here deserved to know what actually happened. Several people nodded slightly. Elliot spoke first. I appreciate that, he said. Serena added quietly, so do I. Graham looked down at the table. I'm sorry, he said. The words were directed at me. They sounded genuine. I nodded once. I know. My father exhaled slowly. Then he turned toward Mr. Hargreaves. You've heard her. She isn't pressing charges. The investigator shook his head gently. That decision does not belong entirely to Miss Parker. The room stiffened. Identity fraud cases are reviewed independently by the bank, he continued. Cooperation simply helps resolve them more efficiently. My father's jaw tightened again. In other words, this continues whether she wants it to or not. Correct. My mother looked suddenly fragile again. This could destroy us. Moira spoke calmly. It already did. The truth of that statement settled over the room like a quiet snowfall because the damage had not begun tonight. It had begun the moment the loan application was submitted under my name. Tonight had simply revealed it. Serena leaned forward slightly. Julia, she said carefully, if the bank reassigns the loan, will you still be responsible for the payments you've already made? Mr. Hargreaves answered before I could. In confirmed fraud cases, repayment responsibility can shift retroactively. Serena blinked. You mean she could get that money back? Potentially. Graham's head snapped up. You've paid £23,000? I nodded. Yes. He looked at my father. Dad. My father said nothing. Because the math was simple now. If the loan returned to him, the remaining balance would follow, and possibly the payments already made. For the first time all evening, I saw something close to fear move through his expression. Not embarrassment, not anger, real financial fear. The same kind I had felt when the bank first called years ago. My mother whispered something. But my father was still looking at me. You planned this. The accusation sounded hollow. Yes, I did. The room remained silent. Because planning was not the crime here. The crime had already happened. This evening had simply been documentation. Mr. Hargreaves glanced toward the sideboard where the untouched desserts still waited. Then he looked back at the table. I believe we've clarified most of the relevant details, he said politely. My father sank slowly back into his chair. For the first time in decades, he looked smaller. Not physically, but structurally. The authority he had relied on had been dismantled piece by piece in front of the entire family, and the most remarkable part was that I had never raised my voice. Moira reached for her coffee cup again. She took a small sip. Then, she looked at me. "You've become very calm," she said. It took practice. The room relaxed slightly, because the storm had passed, but its aftermath remained. People were still processing what they had witnessed, a family hierarchy collapsing quietly over dinner. Serena leaned toward Graham. "You need to talk to the bank tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "Yes." My father said nothing, because for the first time, the next steps were no longer his decision. I closed the folder completely. The leather clasp clicked softly, and as I did, the door at the far end of the dining room opened. Someone new stepped inside. At first, no one paid much attention, just another late arrival. Another relative, perhaps. But Moira noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she smiled. "Ah! Well, this evening isn't finished after all, because the person who had just walked into the room was someone my parents absolutely did not expect to see, and their arrival was about to dismantle the last piece of the story they had spent years protecting." Part 17. The door opened quietly enough that at first the room barely noticed. A soft click of the handle. The faint rush of cooler air from the corridor outside. One of the waiters turned his head automatically, expecting perhaps another staff member carrying coffee or clearing plates. But Aunt Moira had already seen who stepped through. Her small smile appeared before the rest of us even registered the movement. "Ah," she said softly. Several people looked toward her, then followed her gaze. The man who entered paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with the brief uncertainty of someone arriving slightly later than intended. He wore a dark coat folded neatly over one arm and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to walking into unfamiliar spaces without apology. For a moment, I thought he might be another investigator. Then recognition spread slowly across the room, because he was not a stranger, at least not to everyone. Elliot stood halfway from his chair. "David?" The man smiled faintly. "Evening." The name moved across the table in a ripple. David Ross, my cousin Margaret's husband's brother. But that wasn't why his presence mattered. What mattered was the job he held. Serena recognized it first. Her eyes widened slightly. "Wait, aren't you?" She didn't finish the sentence, but the room already knew. David Ross worked for the Financial Conduct Authority, not the bank. The regulator, the institution that oversaw how banks handled cases exactly like this one. My father went completely still. For years he had navigated financial systems with confidence, business dealings, investments, negotiations. He understood banks, he understood accountants. But regulators, they were something else. They existed outside the normal structure of influence. David stepped farther into the room. "Sorry to arrive late," he said. "Margaret mentioned there was a gathering tonight and thought I might want to stop by." Margaret looked startled. "I didn't realize you actually would." David gave a small shrug. Curiosity. His gaze drifted across the table. It stopped on the documents. Then on Mr. Hargreaves. Recognition flickered immediately. "Well, that explains the atmosphere." Mr. Hargreaves nodded politely. "Mr. Ross." My father's eyes moved sharply between the two men. "You know each other?" David answered calmly. "Professional circles tend to overlap." He stepped closer to the table. "Mind if I ask what's happening here?" No one spoke immediately, because suddenly the evening had gained a second layer of consequence. Not just a bank investigation, a regulatory one. Mr. Hargreaves gestured lightly toward the documents. "We've been discussing a historical student loan application submitted under Miss Parker's name." David glanced at me briefly. Julia. It had been years since I'd seen him, but his memory was excellent. "Hotel management, wasn't it?" "Yes." He nodded approvingly. "Good field." Then he looked down at the signatures and the payment records and the authorization form. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's quite a collection of documentation for a family dinner." No one laughed. David looked up. "Who submitted the loan application?" The question was simple, direct, and far more dangerous coming from someone outside the family. My father spoke before anyone else could answer. This is a private matter. David tilted his head slightly. It may have started that way. His gaze returned to the paperwork. But identity misuse connected to financial institutions tends to expand beyond private territory. The calm way he said it made the words heavier. My mother looked almost ill now. This is being blown completely out of proportion. David studied her for a moment. Perhaps. Then he turned to Mr. Hargreaves. Is the bank already reviewing the account? Yes. Formal audit reopened 3 days ago. David nodded. Interesting timing. My father's voice hardened. What exactly is your role here? David met his gaze calmly. At the moment? Just a relative who walked into a very educational conversation. The faintest hint of humor appeared in his expression, but humor did nothing to soften the weight of the situation. Serena leaned toward Graham and whispered something. He nodded slowly. Across the table, Moira watched David with clear amusement, because she understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to grasp. The audience had changed. Before David entered, the story existed mostly within the family and the bank's investigation. Now someone from the regulatory side had heard it as well, which meant the paper trail had become more valuable. David looked again at the signature comparison page. May I? I slid it toward him. He examined the handwriting carefully, then the birthday card, then the expired authorization form. After a few seconds, he let out a quiet breath. That's unfortunate. The understatement almost made Serena laugh. Unfortunate? He nodded. From a compliance standpoint, yes. My father crossed his arms again. You're making assumptions based on incomplete context. David looked up. Then perhaps you should provide the context. The room went silent again, because the question had returned to the same place it had earlier. Explanation. But this time, the audience included someone who understood financial regulations better than anyone at the table. My father hesitated. Then he repeated the explanation he had already given. The loan was arranged to support Graham's business venture. David listened without interrupting. When the explanation ended, he asked one question. Was Miss Parker aware of the loan when it was submitted? But no one spoke. David looked at me. Were you? No. He nodded slowly. And did you authorize anyone to apply for the loan on your behalf? No. He leaned back slightly. That simplifies things. My father's voice snapped. It does nothing of the sort. David's eyes returned to the documents. Actually, it does. The calm certainty in his tone felt heavier than any accusation, because now the story had moved beyond family interpretation into regulatory language. Serena spoke quietly. What does that mean? David looked at her. It means the documentation suggests identity misuse. My father stood again. You keep using that phrase. Yes, because it describes the situation accurately. The room felt smaller again, because now two professionals, one from the bank, one from the regulator, were looking at the same evidence and reaching the same conclusion. Moira folded her hands again. Well, that seems rather definitive. My father looked around the table. But this time, he was not looking for allies. He was realizing something else. Every person in the room had heard the explanation. Every person had seen the documents. Every person now understood what had happened. And family reputation, his most reliable shield, had just evaporated. David placed the signature page back on the table. I'd recommend cooperating fully with the bank's review, he said calmly. My father's voice was tight. Or what? David met his gaze. Or the situation may expand beyond the bank. The words hung in the air. Not a threat. A fact. And suddenly the evening had become far bigger than a family confrontation over dinner, because now the collapse of my parents' story was moving into official territory, where records mattered and consequences followed. Part 18. If the room had felt tense before David arrived, it now felt like the air had been quietly replaced with something heavier. Not dramatic, just dense. Every person at the table understood, at least on some instinctive level, that the evening had crossed another invisible boundary. Before, this had been a family confrontation with a bank investigator present. Now someone from the regulatory side had seen the documents, heard the explanation, and confirmed the same conclusion. Identity misuse. No one needed to say the word fraud again. It was already sitting in the middle of the table. David Ross stood calmly beside the chair Elliot had offered him, though he had not sat down yet. Instead, he looked over the papers once more, his attention moving with professional efficiency from one document to the next. Signature comparison, loan agreement, payment records, expired authorization, the birthday card. He didn't touch them again. He didn't need to. Mr. Hargreaves had already done the formal documentation. David was simply verifying the pattern. My father was watching him carefully now. "There are procedures for these things," he said stiffly. "Yes," David replied. "There are." The tone of his voice carried neither sympathy nor hostility, just clarity. Across the table, Serena spoke quietly. "What happens if the bank decides the loan was obtained improperly?" David answered without hesitation. Then the responsibility will likely revert to the person who submitted the application." My mother inhaled sharply again. "You keep saying that, as if it's already decided." David looked at her. "Nothing is decided until the review concludes." Then he added gently, "But the documentation here makes the review fairly straightforward." The word straightforward sounded almost brutal in the calm way he said it. Because for 6 years my parents had relied on complexity to keep the situation hidden. Tonight, the situation had become very simple. My father's eyes moved toward me again. "You brought him here." The accusation carried less certainty than the earlier ones. I shook my head. "No." David chuckled softly. "I assure you, I was not invited." Margaret nodded quickly. "He wasn't. I just mentioned the gathering earlier this week." Moira looked amused again. Curious timing, though. David shrugged slightly. "Sometimes things align." My father's frustration returned. "You're all acting as if this was some calculated crime." Mr. Hargreaves answered calmly. "It was a calculated decision." The difference between those two things is largely legal language. The room went quiet again, because that sentence had quietly removed the last protective layer of the narrative. Calculated, deliberate, not accidental. Graham looked at the papers again. "Dad, you signed her name?" The question sounded almost childlike. My father did not answer immediately, but silence had already become its own form of admission. Serena looked at him. "You could have ruined her credit for life." My father turned toward her sharply. "I protected this family." The words came out louder than he intended. No one responded, because the problem with that sentence was obvious now. He had protected part of the family at the expense of someone else. Moira spoke gently. "Protection that harms the wrong person isn't protection." My mother covered her face briefly with one hand. "I can't believe this is happening tonight." David glanced toward the sideboard where the untouched desserts still waited. In fairness, most regulatory matters do not usually unfold during dinner. That actually drew the faintest smile from Elliot, but the tension remained. Mr. Hargreaves looked at his watch. "I'll be submitting my report to the bank tomorrow morning." My father's head snapped toward him. "You can't finalize anything based on this. It's not based on this conversation, Mr. Parker." The investigator gestured toward the folder. "It's based on the documents your daughter has already provided." The room absorbed that detail. Already provided, meaning the process had begun before tonight, which meant the confrontation had not been the trigger, it had simply been the revelation. My father looked at me again. "You planned this very carefully." "Yes." Serena nodded slowly. "That makes sense." My mother stared at her. "You think this is reasonable?" Serena met her gaze. "I think carrying someone else's debt for 6 years without knowing why probably changes your perspective." No one disagreed. Even Graham remained silent. David finally pulled a chair slightly away from the table and sat down. He didn't join the group exactly. He simply positioned himself where he could see the documents clearly. "One thing is certain," he said calmly. "The bank will resolve the financial responsibility." My father exhaled heavily. And our reputation? David looked at him for a long moment. Reputation tends to follow behavior. The simplicity of the sentence left no room for interpretation. Moira nodded approvingly. That has always been true. Across the table, Serena leaned closer to Graham. We'll sort out what happens next, she whispered. He nodded faintly. But my father was still staring at me, because the evening had exposed something he had never believed possible. The scapegoat had stopped absorbing the damage. And once that happens, the entire structure shifts. Finally, he asked quietly, "Why tonight?" It was the first genuine question he had asked me all evening. Not defensive, not strategic, just confused. I answered honestly, because you invited everyone. The room understood immediately. Funeral reading, family reunion, a table full of witnesses. The perfect setting for a narrative reversal. Moira smiled faintly again. Yes, that was rather elegant. My father shook his head slowly. You could have destroyed us privately, perhaps, but private conversations were how the truth disappeared for 6 years. David glanced at the documents once more. Then he said something that shifted the weight of the evening again. Actually, there's one detail we haven't discussed yet. Every head turned toward him. He tapped the payment record page lightly. These payments stopped 3 years ago from Mr. Parker's account. My father frowned. Yes. Then they continued. From Julia's account. Correct. David leaned back slightly in his chair, but there's an interesting transaction just before that change. The room leaned closer. What transaction? Elliot asked. David pointed to a line near the middle of the page. A transfer from the Parker household account into a separate investment fund. The date was circled. 2 days before the loan payments shifted to Julia. The silence returned, because suddenly the timeline had gained another piece. My father's face went still, and for the first time all evening, he looked genuinely afraid. Part 19. The moment David pointed to the circled transaction, the entire room leaned closer again. Not out of curiosity alone, out of instinct. Because everyone present had already learned something important about the documents spread across the table. Every new detail changed the story. Before that moment, the narrative had been painful but contained. My father had used my name to secure the loan. The money had gone to support Graham's failing venture. When the business collapsed, the payments eventually shifted to me. Unfair, dishonest, but contained. Now David was pointing at something else. A transaction that happened 2 days before the payments moved to my account. My father had gone completely still. And when someone who had spent his entire life controlling rooms suddenly stopped speaking, people noticed. Elliot leaned closer to the page. What kind of transfer? David tapped the number. £70,000. A quiet ripple moved through the table. 70,000? Margaret whispered. That's more than the loan itself. Exactly, David said. He turned slightly toward my father. Would you like to explain that? My father's eyes remained on the document. For several seconds, he didn't respond. My mother spoke first. It was an investment. Her voice sounded brittle. David nodded politely. Yes, that appears to be correct. He slid the page slightly so the column was easier to read. The transfer moved into a private investment account under Mr. Parker's name. Moira raised one eyebrow. 2 days before Julia suddenly became responsible for the loan payments. No one said anything, because the implication had already formed. Graham spoke slowly. Dad, that money wasn't from my business account. No, it wasn't. David answered calmly. The funds appear to have come from the Parker household's primary account. My father finally lifted his head. That has nothing to do with this situation. David's expression remained neutral. It might. Serena frowned. How? David pointed again to the numbers. Because the loan payments stopped from this account immediately after the transfer. My cousin Elliot understood first. Wait. He looked up sharply. You moved £70,000 into an investment account, then stopped paying the loan? My father's voice hardened again. I rearranged my finances. Moira smiled faintly. Convenient timing. My mother shook her head. You're twisting everything. David remained calm. Actually, the timeline speaks for itself. 2 days before the loan payments shifted to Julia's account, a large sum moved into a separate investment. He paused, which meant the funds previously used to cover the loan were no longer available. The room fell silent, because suddenly the story looked very different. For 3 years, my father had paid the loan. Then he moved £70,000 into a personal investment. 2 days later, the payments stopped, and the bank began collecting from me instead. Serena whispered something under her breath. "Oh my God." Graham stared at the page. "Dad." My father spoke sharply. The loan payments were Julia's responsibility at that point. I met his gaze. Because the business had already failed, he didn't answer. Because everyone now understood what had actually happened. The debt hadn't been transferred gradually. It had been abandoned. Moira folded her hands again. "You didn't just use Julia's identity. You also decided she could absorb the consequences once it became inconvenient." My mother shook her head desperately. "That's not fair." But fairness had left the room a long time ago. Mr. Hargreaves spoke again, his voice still measured. "This information will likely be included in the bank's review." My father looked furious now. "That investment has nothing to do with the loan." David tilted his head. "Possibly, but the timing suggests otherwise." Across the table, Serena looked at Graham again. "Did you know about this?" He shook his head slowly. "No." Elliot leaned back in his chair. "So the money that could have finished paying the loan went into an investment instead." My father's jaw tightened. "Financial decisions are rarely that simple," Moira replied gently. "Some of them are." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything earlier in the evening, because the room had crossed another threshold. At first, the story had been about a desperate decision to protect Graham's business. Now it looked like something else. A calculation, a decision that once the business failed, the debt could simply be left with me. Serena spoke quietly. "You had the money to keep paying." My father didn't answer. The answer was already visible in the numbers. David leaned back slightly. "The bank will probably find that detail very interesting." My father glared at him. "You seem to enjoy this." "Not particularly." David's voice remained calm. "But financial responsibility tends to follow documentation." The phrase echoed softly in the room. Documentation. For years, my parents had relied on narrative. Tonight, the narrative had collapsed under the weight of numbers. My mother looked at me again. "Julia?" Her voice sounded smaller than it had all evening. "I never wanted this to happen." I looked at her calmly. It already did. The words were not cruel, just factual. Across the table, Graham finally pushed his chair back slightly. "I need some air." Serena nodded and stood with him. They stepped away from the table quietly, moving toward no one stopped them, because everyone understood what they needed. Distance. Perspective. Time to process what they had just learned about their own family. Moira watched them leave. Then she turned to my father. "You know what the real tragedy is?" He didn't answer. She continued anyway. "You assumed Julia would always carry it quietly." The sentence settled into the room like a verdict, because that had been the foundation of everything. For years, the system worked because I stayed silent. Now the silence had ended. David looked at the documents one last time, then he closed the folder gently and slid it back toward me. "You've done exactly what people are supposed to do when something like this happens." My father laughed bitterly. "Destroy the family?" David shook his head. "Create a record." The difference between those two things would matter very soon, because now the story had moved far beyond dinner, far beyond embarrassment, into something permanent. And somewhere outside the dining room, Graham was already beginning to understand that the business failure years ago had never been the real disaster. The real disaster had been the decision made afterward. Part 20. After Graham and Serena stepped out into the corridor, the room felt strangely hollow. 2 chairs empty, 2 glasses of water untouched, 2 people suddenly absent from a conversation that had revolved around them for years without their full knowledge. It created an odd shift in gravity at the table. For the first time that evening, my father no longer had Graham beside him. The dynamic that had shaped our entire childhood, the favored son and the inconvenient daughter, had quietly rearranged itself. Now he sat across from me with only witnesses between us. And witnesses, unlike family hierarchies, do not protect anyone. David Ross leaned back slightly in his chair, no longer studying the documents. He seemed satisfied that the relevant facts had already surfaced. The investigation would continue through official channels later. Tonight had simply exposed the shape of the story. Mr. Hargreaves checked his watch again. "I'll need to leave shortly," he said politely. "But I believe the essential information has been clarified." My father did not respond. He was staring at the payment record page again. The circled transaction, £70,000. 2 days before the loan payments shifted onto my account. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely tired. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. My mother sat beside him with both hands clasped together now, her composure completely gone. The gentle, sympathetic hostess who had greeted guests earlier had disappeared entirely. "Julia," she said quietly. I looked at her. "You didn't have to do this in front of everyone." It was almost the same since my father had used earlier. The same argument. Privacy. Control. Narrative. But now the room understood something that had taken me years to learn. Privacy had never protected me. It had protected them. Moira answered before I could. "Actually, she did." My mother looked at her. "Excuse me?" Moira spoke gently but with unmistakable clarity. "For 6 years, Julia carried a debt she didn't authorize. Every private conversation you had with her during that time reinforced the idea that the situation was somehow her responsibility." My mother's lips pressed together. "We believed it was." Moira nodded. "That's precisely the problem." Silence returned again, because Moira had articulated something that everyone in the room now recognized. Belief had been the foundation of the system. If enough people believed the story, it functioned. Once the belief collapsed, so did the structure. My father finally spoke again. "What exactly do you expect to happen now?" The question sounded less like a challenge this time, more like resignation. Mr. Hargreaves answered calmly. "The bank will complete its review." He gestured lightly toward the documents. "Given the information presented tonight, its likely responsibility for the loan will be reassigned." My father rubbed his forehead. "And the payments she's already made? Those may also be reviewed." My mother looked stunned again. "You mean we would have to repay her?" "Potentially." The word carried enormous weight. £23,000, plus the remaining balance. My father closed his eyes briefly, because suddenly the financial consequences he had once pushed quietly onto me were returning home. David spoke quietly from the other side of the table. "Situations like this usually move faster once the facts are clear." My father looked at him. "You seem very certain." "Not certain, just familiar with how these reviews tend to go." Across the table, Elliot leaned forward again. "Can the bank really reverse everything after 6 years?" "Yes," Mr. Hargreaves replied simply. "Fraud cases often involve older documentation. The room absorbed that. 6 years. The length of time that had once protected the deception had now become irrelevant." My mother looked at me again. "Julia?" There was something different in her voice now. Not accusation, not manipulation, something closer to fear. "Will you testify if the bank asks you to?" The question hovered quietly. I thought about it for a moment, then I answered honestly. "Yes." The word did not carry anger, just certainty. My father let out a slow breath. "So that's it." No one responded, because in many ways, it was. The story that had protected them for years had collapsed in a single evening. Now the consequences would unfold through paperwork rather than argument. Moira reached for her coffee again. It had grown cold. She didn't seem to mind. Then she looked at me with a faint smile. "You handled that rather elegantly." I shrugged slightly. "Hotel management teaches you how to manage difficult rooms." That actually drew a small laugh from Elliot. "Fair point." My father did not laugh. He looked around the table slowly, at the relatives who had once nodded along with his explanations, at the investigator, at the regulator, at the empty chairs where Graham and Serena had been sitting. The room no longer belonged to him. That realization seemed to land heavily. Finally, he said something almost reflective. "I always thought the family would stay united." Moira answered gently, "Families stay united when they're honest with each other, not when one person carries the burden for everyone else." The sentence settled quietly over the table. My mother stood slowly. "I need some air," she said. No one stopped her as she walked toward the corridor. For a moment, my father remained seated alone. Then he pushed his chair back and stood as well. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "Mr. Hargreaves replied calmly. "No, it's just beginning." My father left the room without another word. The door closed softly behind him. For the first time all evening, the dining room felt strangely peaceful. The storm had passed. What remained now was simply the aftermath. Elliot looked at the untouched desserts along the sideboard. "Well, that was not the dinner I expected tonight." Moira smiled faintly. "Family gatherings rarely are." David stood up again. "I'll let the bank handle the next steps." He glanced at me briefly. "But you did the right thing." Then he added something quietly. "People assume systems like this never change. They do. It just takes documentation." I nodded, because that had been the entire point. For years, my parents' version of events had lived comfortably inside the family narrative. Tonight, it had encountered something stronger: evidence, witnesses, and the simple fact that the scapegoat had finally stopped playing the role. Across the table, Serena returned slowly from the corridor. Graham followed a few steps behind her. His expression looked different now, quieter, more thoughtful. He sat down again and looked directly at me. "I'll help fix this," he said. I believed him, not because he suddenly felt heroic, but because the illusion protecting him had just collapsed too. And once illusions disappear, people sometimes become honest. Moira watched the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction, because she had understood the real ending long before anyone else. The moment the documents touched the table, the old family hierarchy had already begun to dissolve. And once that kind of truth appears in public, it doesn't disappear again. Part 21. The strangest part about the end of the confrontation was how ordinary the room suddenly felt. Nothing about the dining room had physically changed. The candles still flickered softly against the polished wood panels. The waiters still moved carefully along the edges of the space, uncertain whether the gathering was finished or merely paused. The untouched desserts still waited on the sideboard, their perfect presentation now oddly out of place after everything that had been said. But the atmosphere had shifted completely. For years, whenever I walked into a family gathering, I carried an invisible weight. It wasn't just the debt or the quiet resentment or the rehearsed explanations about why I lived far away and worked too much. It was the role, the unspoken understanding that I was the difficult one, the independent one, the child who had somehow drifted away from the warmth of the family. That story had been repeated so many times that people stopped questioning it. Tonight, for the first time, that story no longer existed. And when a narrative disappears, the space it leaves behind can feel surprisingly calm. Graham sat across from me now with both elbows resting on the table, his hands loosely clasped together. The defensive edge he normally carried had vanished. Without the old system supporting him, he looked younger somehow, less certain, more human. Serena sat beside him, watching the room quietly. Every so often, her eyes moved toward the folder resting near my hand, as if confirming that the documents inside were real. Moira remained exactly where she had been most of the evening, her posture relaxed, her small cup of cold coffee still in front of her. Of everyone present, she seemed the least surprised by the outcome. People who spend decades observing families learn to recognize patterns long before they collapse. Elliot finally pushed his chair back slightly and stretched. "Well," he said with a quiet exhale, "that was Educational. Margaret nodded faintly. I had no idea any of this was happening. Serena looked at me. Did anyone know? I shook my head. Not really. Moira raised a finger gently. I suspected something. Everyone looked at her. She shrugged lightly. Julia stopped coming to holidays several years ago. Your mother always said it was because she preferred work to family. Her eyes moved toward the empty doorway where my parents had left. But stories like that usually hide something. Serena nodded slowly. Yes, they do. Graham stared at the table. I should have noticed. I leaned back in my chair slightly. You trusted what you were told. He shook his head. That's not the same thing as paying attention. The honesty in his voice caught several people off guard. For most of his life, Graham had existed comfortably inside the structure our parents created for him. That structure had never required much self-examination. Tonight, it had disappeared, which meant he had to examine things now. Serena reached over and touched his arm gently. We'll sort it out. He nodded once, then he looked back at me. I meant what I said earlier about helping fix this. I studied his face for a moment. It was strange. All evening, the person who had caused the most damage in my life had not been Graham. It had been the system that protected him. Now that system was gone, and suddenly he looked like someone who actually wanted to do the right thing. We'll see what the bank says, I replied. That seemed to satisfy him. Across the table, Elliot picked up one of the dessert menus and glanced at it absently. It's funny, he said. What? Margaret asked. I always thought Julia was the one who distanced herself from the family. The sentence hovered quietly in the room, because that had been the official story. Serena gave a small, knowing smile. It's amazing how often the person labeled difficult turns out to be the one refusing to carry someone else's problems. Moira chuckled softly. Yes. The scapegoat role is very convenient until it stops working. The word scapegoat no longer sounded uncomfortable now. It sounded accurate. And outside in the corridor, footsteps passed briefly. A few other guests from neighboring rooms walked by without realizing what had unfolded behind the closed doors of this private dining space. I found myself looking at the candles again. The flames moved gently in the air, casting soft shadows along the table. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents with anger. Instead, the evening had unfolded with remarkable calm. Evidence had done most of the work. That was the part people often misunderstood about accountability. You didn't need volume, you needed records. Graham cleared his throat. So, what happens next? The question seemed to belong to the entire table now. I answered honestly. The bank finishes its review. Serena nodded, and if they reassign the loan, then it moves back to the person who applied for it. Graham looked toward the empty doorway again. Dad. Yes, Serena said quietly. He rubbed his face with one hand. This is going to destroy him. Moira tilted her head slightly. No. Everyone looked at her. She continued calmly. What destroys people is refusing to face the consequences of their decisions. Her eyes drifted toward the folder again. Tonight simply removed the illusion. Silence followed that. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Elliot finally stood and walked toward the sideboard. After everything that happened, I feel like someone should at least eat the dessert. Margaret laughed softly. That's the most practical thing anyone has said all evening. He picked up a small plate and brought back a lemon tart. Anyone? Moira accepted one. Serena took another. For a moment, the room almost felt like a normal family gathering again. Almost. Graham remained seated. Then he looked at me one more time. I really didn't know. I know. And I did. That was the strange part of the whole situation. The person who had benefited most from the deception had not actually designed it. My father had. Which meant the consequences waiting outside the room were his alone. Moira finished the last bite of her dessert and set the fork down neatly. You know, she said, there's something very satisfying about seeing a family myth collapse under proper documentation. Serena smiled faintly. Yes, there is. I closed the leather folder again and slid it gently into my bag. For the first time in 6 years, it no longer felt heavy. because the truth had finally left the private corners where it had been hidden. Now it existed in the open, in front of witnesses, in official records, and most importantly, in the minds of everyone who had sat at this table tonight. Family systems survive on silence, but once the silence breaks, the system rarely survives with it. Outside in the corridor, the elevator doors opened and closed again. Somewhere in the building, my parents were likely standing in separate corners of the lobby, each trying to understand how an evening they had planned to control had turned into something else entirely. And as I stood up from the table, I realized something surprising. For the first time since the bank had called all those years ago, I felt completely calm. Part 22. Leaving the dining room felt quieter than arriving. No dramatic exits, no raised voices echoing down the corridor, just chairs being pushed back slowly, the soft clink of forks against empty plates, and the low murmur of relatives trying to process what they had witnessed. The private room that had held decades of family narrative now looked strangely ordinary again. Candles burned lower. The desserts had been partially eaten. The documents that had rewritten 6 years of history were back inside my handbag. Evidence packed away like any other personal belonging. Yet the room itself had changed, because everyone inside it knew something they hadn't known when the evening began. The truth. Graham and Serena were the first to leave the table. They paused near me as I slipped my coat over my shoulders. Serena spoke quietly. "If the bank contacts us, we'll cooperate." I nodded. "I believe you." Graham looked uncomfortable, but determined. "I'll talk to Dad tomorrow." That sounded like a difficult conversation. I didn't envy him, but I also knew something Graham was only beginning to understand. For the first time in his life, he would be speaking to our father without the old family structure protecting him. That kind of conversation tends to be very honest. Serena gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for telling the truth tonight." The words caught me slightly off guard. Most people expected anger or confrontation in situations like this. "Not gratitude. You deserve to know," I said. She nodded. "Yes." Then they left together, walking slowly down the corridor toward the elevators. Moira watched them go with quiet interest. "You know," she said softly, "that marriage might actually survive this." I glanced at her. "You think so?" "Serena married Graham." "Not the family mythology." She picked up her coat with careful movements. "Once people see the real structure, they have a chance to build something healthier." That sounded optimistic, but Moira had lived long enough to know when systems broke and when they reformed. Elliot and Margaret gathered their things next. Elliot paused beside me before leaving. "I'm sorry you carried that alone for so long." I shrugged slightly. I didn't know how to explain it. He nodded. "That makes sense. Because from the outside, your parents always seem so certain about their version of things." "Exactly." He gave a small shake of his head. "Documentation beats certainty every time." Margaret smiled gently. "Take care of yourself, Julia." "I will." They left quietly, their footsteps fading down the hallway. Soon the room held only 3 people: Moira, David Ross, and me. The waiters had begun clearing the table, carefully collecting plates and glasses as if nothing unusual had happened. Years of hospitality training had taught them when not to ask questions. David stood near the doorway, adjusting the sleeve of his coat. "You handled that extremely well," he said. I smiled faintly. Practice. He studied me for a moment. "Most people in your position would have lost their temper." I thought about that, maybe 6 years ago. But anger burns out eventually. Documentation lasts longer. That seemed to amuse him slightly. "Yes, it does. Moira walked slowly toward the door beside him. "You'll make sure the bank follows proper procedure?" David nodded. "Mr. Hargreaves will handle the review. But regulators tend to pay attention when cases involve identity misuse within families." My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory. "You're destroying this family." I wondered if he still believed that. Perhaps he did. But families built on scapegoats eventually collapse anyway. tonight had simply accelerated the process. David opened the door for Moira. Then he paused and looked back at me. One piece of advice. What? When the bank contacts you for formal statements, stick to documentation, not emotion. I nodded. That had been my strategy all evening. Good. He gave a small nod of approval. Then he and Moira stepped out into the corridor together. The door closed softly behind them. For a moment, I stood alone in the dining room. The staff continued clearing the table. The candles were nearly burned down now. A waiter approached carefully. Would you like us to call a car for you? No, thank you. I'll walk. Edinburgh at night was cool this time of year. Walking felt right. I picked up my handbag and stepped into the hallway. The corridor outside was quiet, the thick carpet muffling every footstep. Halfway to the elevators, I saw my mother. She was standing near the window overlooking George Street, her coat still unbuttoned, her posture tense. She turned when she heard my footsteps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city lights outside reflected faintly in the glass behind her. Julia, she said. Her voice sounded tired. I stopped a few feet away. Yes? She hesitated. Then she asked the question I had half expected all evening. Did you ever hate us for it? The question surprised me anyway. I considered the answer carefully. For a while, I said. Her eyes lowered. I'm sorry, the words came out quietly. Not defensive. Not strategic, just tired. For the first time all evening, my mother looked less like the architect of a family narrative and more like someone realizing how badly it had failed. I nodded once. I believe you. But that didn't undo 6 years of consequences. She seemed to understand that. Your father won't recover from this easily, she said. Probably not. She studied my face. Are you satisfied now? Satisfied wasn't the right word. Relieved was closer. The truth exists now, I said. She nodded slowly. Yes, it does. For a moment we stood there in silence. Then she stepped aside. You should go. I walked toward the exit. The glass doors opened automatically as I approached, letting the cool Edinburgh night air drift inside. Behind me, my mother remained standing in the corridor, watching. Not stopping me, not trying to rewrite the story again, just watching the moment pass. And as I stepped out onto George Street, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of that debt alone anymore. Part 23. The night air on George Street felt colder than it had earlier. Not unpleasant, just sharp enough to remind me I was no longer inside the controlled warmth of the hotel dining room. Edinburgh at night carried a particular stillness in late autumn, the kind where the streetlights glowed softly against old stone buildings and the distant sound of traffic seemed almost polite. For a moment, I simply stood on the pavement. Behind me, the hotel doors slid shut again with a quiet, mechanical sigh. Inside those walls, years of family narrative had unraveled over dinner. Outside, the city continued exactly as it always had. People walked past without noticing me. A taxi rolled slowly along the curb. Somewhere down the block, a group of tourists laughed too loudly as they tried to find their way toward Princess Street. Life moved on. That realization felt oddly grounding. 6 years of quiet financial pressure had lived almost entirely inside my own head. Every month, when the loan payment left my account, the same thought had followed it. How did this become my responsibility? Tonight, that question finally had a public answer. Documentation had done its job. I started walking. The pavement was slightly damp from a brief rain earlier in the evening. Reflections from shop windows shimmered faintly under the streetlights as I moved past them. After half a block, I heard footsteps behind me. Not hurried, measured. I turned. Graham stood a few paces back, his hands in the pockets of his coat. Serena was beside him. They must have left the hotel shortly after I did. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Graham said quietly, "You always did walk everywhere." I smiled faintly. "Hotel shifts end late. You get used to it." Serena stepped closer. "We didn't want you leaving alone. I appreciated that more than I expected." "I'm fine." "We know," she said, "but still." We walked together for a few moments in silence. The city felt peaceful. Finally, Graham spoke again. I keep thinking about something. What? The way Dad said you were always capable. I glanced at him. Yes, he kicked lightly at a small pebble on the pavement. That was supposed to sound like praise when we were kids. It did, but tonight it sounded different. I nodded slightly because I could carry more. Exactly. He stopped walking. I turned to face him. I should have noticed earlier, he said. The way things always landed on you. I shrugged. Family systems are subtle. He gave a short laugh. That's a polite way of putting it. Serena rested a hand on his arm. You were raised inside it. It's hard to see structures when you grow up believing they're normal. That seemed to help him a little. Still, he said, I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything. He shook his head. That loan funded my business, even if I didn't know how it was arranged. He looked genuinely troubled now. If the bank moves the debt back to Dad, I'm still responsible for the damage. Serena nodded. We'll figure out what that looks like. I studied them both for a moment. The strange thing about the evening was how it had rearranged relationships. For years, Graham had existed on the opposite side of the family hierarchy. Now we stood on the same pavement having a completely honest conversation for the first time. Let's wait for the bank review, I said. He nodded. Fair. Serena smiled gently. You handled that dinner with incredible calm. I laughed quietly. Working in hospitality helps. Difficult guests, high-pressure situations, you learn to stay composed. That's one way to describe your parents. She said it carefully, not wanting to sound cruel. But the truth was simple. Tonight had changed the way everyone saw them. We resumed walking. Halfway down the block, Graham spoke again. You know something strange? What? For years I thought you stayed away from the family because you didn't care about us. I glanced at him. And now? Now I realize you stayed away because you were protecting yourself. Yes, he nodded slowly. That makes a lot more sense. Serena looked toward the sky. Do you think your father will admit what happened when the bank contacts him? I considered that, eventually. He values reputation too much to risk a larger investigation. Graham sighed. That sounds like him. We reached the corner where our paths separated. My flat was another 10 minutes walk uphill. They were heading toward a car park on the next street. Graham stopped again. Julia? Yes? I'm glad you told the truth tonight. So am I. He hesitated. Then he did something unexpected. He hugged me. Not the polite, slightly distant embrace our family had always practiced at holidays. A real one. Brief, but genuine. Serena smiled. Take care of yourself. You too. They walked toward the car park. I continued uphill. The quiet of the street felt different now, lighter. Not because the situation had been resolved yet. The bank still had procedures to complete. Statements would be taken, documents reviewed, financial responsibility reassigned. That process might take months, but something important had already happened. The truth was no longer private. It existed in witnesses, in records, in the memories of everyone who had sat at that dinner table. Halfway up the hill, I paused and looked back down toward the lights of George Street. Somewhere inside that hotel, my parents were probably still trying to understand how the evening had escaped their control. For decades, they had relied on a simple formula. Assign the difficult role to one child, protect the other, control the narrative. Tonight the formula stopped working. Not because I argued, not because I shouted, but because documentation and witnesses replaced the story. And once that happens, the system can't recover. I turned and continued walking. The loan still existed on paper for now. The investigation still had steps to complete, but the weight of silence was gone. And that, more than anything else, changed the way the future felt. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like I was walking uphill alone. Part 24. 3 months later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not by email, not through a phone call. A physical envelope, thick and official, waiting in the hotel manager's office when I returned from an early operations meeting. The receptionist had placed it carefully beside my desk computer with the quiet respect people give to documents that look important. The return address belonged to the bank's financial compliance division. For a moment, I simply looked at it. The envelope represented the end of a process that had stretched across years. Not just the investigation that started after Mr. Hargreaves reopened the file, but the long period before that. The silent months when I paid the loan without understanding how it had become mine. Now, the system that had once ignored my questions had completed its review. I sat down, opened the envelope, and read. The language inside was exactly what David Ross had predicted that evening in the hotel dining room. Formal, measured, precise. The bank's investigation had concluded that the student loan consolidation had been submitted without my authorization. The signature on the application had been verified as inconsistent with my official records and more closely matched another handwriting sample provided during the review. Because of that finding, the financial responsibility for the loan had been reassigned. The remaining balance no longer belonged to me, and the payments I had made over the past 3 years, £23,000, would be reimbursed. I read the letter twice, not because I doubted it, because the simplicity of the resolution felt almost surreal after the complexity of the years that led up to it. The system had finally caught up with the truth. Outside my office window, Edinburgh moved through an ordinary weekday morning. Delivery vans passed along the street. Hotel guests checked out at the reception desk below. Somewhere down the hallway, a housekeeping trolley rattled softly over the carpet. Life continued, but something fundamental had changed. I placed the letter back in the envelope and leaned back in my chair. 6 years of quiet financial pressure had ended in a single page of official language. Responsibility reassigned. Payments reimbursed. Case closed. Not entirely closed, of course, because the consequences did not belong only to the bank's records. 2 weeks earlier, Graham had called me. His voice had sounded tired but steady. Dad signed the statement. The words had not surprised me. Eventually, he had no choice. When systems built on reputation face official documentation, the instinct to protect status usually turns into cooperation. What happens now? I had asked. He's responsible for the remaining balance and the payments you made. I see. There had been a pause on the phone. Then Graham said something unexpected. I'm helping him handle it. Not financially. Practically. That sounded like growth. How is he taking it? Silence on the other end. Finally, Graham answered. Quietly. That might have been the most accurate description possible. The kind of quiet that follows the collapse of a story someone believed for a very long time. My mother had called once as well. The conversation had been brief. Your father regrets how things happened, she said. Regret often arrives late, but at least it had arrived. Now, sitting in my office with the bank's letter resting on my desk, I realized something else. The real ending had not been the financial correction. It had happened that evening in the dining room. The moment when the documents appeared on the table, because that was the moment the family narrative stopped controlling the truth. Once witnesses saw the structure clearly, the story could never return to its old shape. A knock sounded gently on the office door. One of the front desk supervisors stepped inside. Sorry to interrupt, Julia. The Regional Hospitality Association president is here for the afternoon conference. He wanted to say hello. I nodded. Send him in. A few moments later, a well-dressed man in his 60s entered the office. Julia Parker, he said warmly. I've heard excellent things about your work here. Thank you. We shook hands. As we spoke about the conference arrangements and hotel operations, I noticed something that would have shocked my parents if they had been there to see it. Professional respect. Recognition earned independently from the family structure that once defined me. The hierarchy that had existed at the dinner table months earlier, where my father's authority overshadowed everything else, had quietly dissolved. In the professional world, documentation mattered. Competence mattered. Reputation followed performance. When the meeting ended, the association president paused at the door. Your team speaks very highly of you. I appreciate that. You've built something impressive here." After he left, I looked down at the envelope again. Then I placed it in the top drawer of my desk. Not hidden, just stored. The document had already done its job. It had rewritten the official record. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted across the old stone buildings of the city. Somewhere across Edinburgh, my father was probably sitting at his own desk, reviewing repayment plans and legal paperwork. For the first time in years, the debt belonged to the person who created it. The town had seen the truth behind the polished family image. Not through shouting, not through scandal, through documentation, witnesses, and the quiet competence of someone who refused to carry the role assigned to her. Family systems survive by repeating the same story until no one questions it. But paperwork is patient, and once the records appear in the open, the story stops belonging to the people who invented it. It belongs to the truth.